I never thought the sound of gravel crunching under tires would sound like a choir of angels. But after 3 weeks in the antiseptic white purgatory of St. Jude's Hospital, the driveway to the Glasshouse estate sounded like heaven. It was a wet afternoon in late October, and the sky was the color of a bruised plum. But to me, it was beautiful because it was my sky, and this was my land. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window and watched the familiar shapes of the oak trees glide by. They were old friends that had stood guard over my property for a century, and seeing them made the dull, throbbing ache in my newly replaced hip recede just a fraction. Caleb was driving my vintage station wagon with a little too much enthusiasm. My nephew had insisted on picking me up personally, and while I usually preferred the silent professionalism of a hired car, I had agreed because family is supposed to matter when you are old and recovering. I looked over at him. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and his jaw was set in a way that reminded me of his father, my late brother, who always drove like he was running away from something. Caleb wore a suit that was too shiny and too tight in the shoulders, and the smell of his cologne was overpowering in the small cabin. It smelled like musk and desperation, and it clashed horribly with the scent of damp earth and pine that was filtering in through the vents. From the back seat came the click, click, click of long acrylic nails tapping against a phone screen. Sienna. I had only met Caleb's fiancée 3 times before this day, and each time she had looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to be reupholstered. She was a striking woman, I suppose, with sharp features and hair that was dyed a shade of blonde that did not exist in nature, but her eyes were cold. They were the color of steel, and they scanned everything with a calculator behind them. She shifted in the back seat and sighed loudly, as if the 20-minute drive from the hospital had been a cross-country odyssey. "We're almost there," Aunt Matilda Caleb said, and his voice was loud and booming in the quiet car. He spoke to me as if the surgery had been on my ears and not my hip. "You must be dying to get out of this car and into a proper bed." "I am dying to check on the humidity levels in the south greenhouse," I said quietly. But I don't think he heard me, or maybe he just chose to ignore it. To Caleb and Sienna, my life work was just a hobby. They did not understand that the orchids in those glass structures were not just flowers. They were my children. They were complex biological puzzles that I had spent 50 years solving. The midnight azure alone was worth more than the car we were riding in, but to them, it was just a purple flower. The car swung around the final bend, and the house came into view. The Victorian manor rose up from the mist like a grand old dame. The paint was peeling slightly around the eaves, and the ivy had grown a bit wild during my absence, but it was majestic, and behind it, glinting in the gray light, were the 3 massive glass houses. My heart gave a little flutter of joy. I just wanted to be inside them. I wanted to smell the moss and the vanilla scent of the stanhopeias and the rich decay of the compost. Caleb parked the car right in front of the heavy oak front doors. He jumped out and rushed around to my side, pulling the door open with a flourish. "Careful now," he said, grabbing my arm with a grip that was firm, bordering on painful. "Let's not have you taking a tumble before you even get inside." I winced as I swung my legs out. The physical therapist had told me to take it slow to move with intention, but Caleb was rushing me. He hoisted me up, and for a moment, I felt like a sack of potting soil being moved from a truck. I steadied myself on my cane and took a deep breath of the fresh air. It tasted sweet and clean after the recirculated air of the hospital ward. Sienna climbed out of the back and stood on the gravel looking up at the house. Her nose wrinkled slightly. "It is remarkably gloomy out here, isn't it?" she said, pulling her cashmere wrap tighter around her shoulders. "It feels like something out of a Gothic novel." "It is peaceful," I corrected her. The plants prefer the diffused light. She just hummed a non-committal sound and walked past me toward the front door, her high heels sinking slightly into the gravel. I watched her go, and a prickle of unease ran down my spine. She walked with a sense of ownership. She didn't wait for me to unlock the door. She stood there, expecting it to open. Caleb guided me up the stone steps. The pain in my hip was sharp but manageable. I focused on the rhythm. Step, cane, step. We reached the porch, and I fumbled in my purse for my keys, but Caleb produced a shiny new key from his pocket and slotted it into the lock. I stared at his hand. "Where did you get that key, Caleb?" He laughed, a nervous barking sound. "Oh, I made a copy when I came to check on the boiler last week, remember?" "Just for emergencies, Aunt Mattie. You can never be too careful." I did not remember asking him to check the boiler. In fact, I distinctly remembered my estate manager, Elias, handling the boiler service before the winter set in. But the door was open, and Caleb was ushering me inside into the grand foyer. The house smelled stale. It smelled of dust and stillness. I wanted to open every window immediately to let the house breathe, but as soon as I stepped onto the Persian rug, I stopped dead. The foyer was different. My antique coat rack, the one carved from black walnut in the shape of a tree, was gone. In its place stood a sleek modern metal stand that looked like a piece of abstract torture equipment, and the rug. The rug had been moved 3 feet to the left, exposing a patch of hardwood floor that was slightly lighter than the rest. I pointed with my cane. "Where is my coat rack?" Sienna appeared from the living room. Her coat was already off. "Oh, that dreadfully heavy thing," she said, waving a hand dismissively. We moved it to the attic. It was blocking the flow of energy in the entryway. "This is much more open, don't you think?" I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck. That dreadfully heavy thing belonged to my grandfather. I said, my voice trembling slightly. And I did not ask for the energy to be flowed. I like my house the way it was. Caleb closed the front door, shutting out the fresh air. Now, Aunt Mattie, don't get upset. Stress is bad for your recovery. Sienna just wanted to make things a little more accessible for you. Less clutter means less chance of tripping, right? We are just thinking of your safety." He put a heavy hand on my shoulder and squeezed. It was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a restraint. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I was tired. The surgery had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit, and standing here arguing about furniture felt impossible. "I just want to go to my room," I said. "I need to rest. And then I need to go to the greenhouse to check the temperature gauges." Caleb and Sienna exchanged a look. It was a quick, fleeting glance, but I caught it. It was the look parents exchange when a child asks for candy before dinner. "Let's get you to your room first," Caleb said, steering me toward the stairs. "But about the greenhouse, Mattie. We think it's best if you stay away from there for a few days. The ground is uneven. It's damp. It's a slip hazard waiting to happen." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked him in the eye. "Caleb, I have walked those greenhouses every day for 40 years. I could navigate them blindfolded. My orchids need me. The automated misting system for the midnight azure is temperamental. If it jams, the plant will dry out in hours." "I'll check it," Caleb said quickly. "I'll go down there myself. You just focus on healing. You wouldn't know what to look for." I snapped, and I heard the sharpness in my own voice. It sounded shrill. I sounded like a cranky old woman, and I hated it. Sienna stepped forward and took my other arm. Her fingers were cold. "Matilda, please. We are only trying to help. You are frail right now. If you fell out there alone, no one would hear you scream." The way she said it sent a chill through me. No one would hear you scream. It was a statement of fact, but it hung in the air like a threat. I let them guide me up the stairs. I was too exhausted to fight them on the landing. My hip was throbbing a steady drumbeat of pain now. We reached my bedroom, and I was relieved to see that at least this sanctuary had not been rearranged. My heavy oak bed was where it belonged. My books were stacked on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. "Thank you, Caleb. I think I can manage from here." He didn't leave, though. He stood in the doorway filling the frame. "Actually, Aunt Mattie, there is one more thing." I looked up. "What is it?" Sienna walked past him and went to the window, looking out over the sprawling lawn. "We brought our things," she said casually. I frowned. "Your things?" "Yes," Caleb said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We moved out of our apartment in the city. The lease was up, and well, with you needing round-the-clock care for at least a few months, it just made sense. We're moving in, just until you're back on your feet, of course." I stared at him. The words seemed to float in the air, refusing to land. Moving in. This was my house. I had lived here alone since my husband died 20 years ago. I liked the silence. I liked my routine. I liked my tea at 4 and my radio programs at 6. "You didn't ask me," I whispered. "We didn't want to worry you while you were in the hospital," Sienna said, turning around. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Besides, family helps family. You can't possibly stay here alone in this condition. It would be irresponsible of us to let you." I heard the sound of a heavy truck engine outside. I leaned forward, trying to see past Sienna out the window. A large moving van was backing up the driveway, its tires churning up the pristine gravel I had raked just before my fall. "That is a very large truck for a temporary stay," I said, and my voice sounded very small in the large room. Caleb walked over and patted my hand. He smelled of musk and lies. "Don't worry about the details, Maddie. You just rest. We'll handle everything. We're going to take such good care of you." He turned and walked out of the room. Sienna lingered for a moment. She looked around my bedroom, her eyes landing on my vanity, where I kept my pearl necklace and the silver brush set. She stared at them for a second too long before turning to me. "Dinner is at 7, she said. "I'm making risotto. And don't worry about dressing up. We're all family here." She closed the door. I heard the latch click. It wasn't locked, I knew that, but the sound felt final. I sat there on the edge of my bed, listening to the beep, beep, beep of the moving truck backing up to my front door. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and angry. I looked at the phone on my nightstand. I wanted to call Elias. I wanted to tell him to come over and stop that truck. I reached for the handset and lifted it to my ear. There was no dial tone, just a hollow, static hiss. I tapped the receiver hook. "Hello? Hello?" Nothing. I set the phone back down. My hand was shaking. I told myself it was just a storm outage. The lines were old. The wind had been picking up. It was a coincidence. Downstairs, I heard the front door bang open and the heavy thud of boxes being dropped on my hardwood floors. My sanctuary was being invaded. The golden cage had closed around me and the lock had clicked shut. I lay back on the pillows and closed my eyes, visualizing the midnight azure in the farthest corner of the greenhouse. "Hold on," I whispered to the empty room. "Just hold on. I'm coming." I woke to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floorboards above my head. It was a grinding vibration that rattled the crystal chandelier in my bedroom and set my teeth on edge. I lay there for a moment, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling plaster, trying to orient myself. The pain in my hip was a dull throb, a reminder of the metal joint that was now a permanent part of me. But the pain in my chest was sharper. It was the heavy realization that I was no longer the master of my own house. I swung my legs out of bed and reached for my cane. My morning routine was a ritual I had perfected over decades. Feet on the floor, deep breath, stand, walk to the window to check the weather, walk to the bathroom, then downstairs for Earl Grey tea and toast. But as soon as I opened my bedroom door, I saw that the ritual had been broken. The hallway runner was gone. The thick Persian runner that had lined the upstairs hall since my mother's time had vanished. In its place was the bare, polished oak floor. It gleamed in the morning light, beautiful but treacherous. For someone with a cane and a new hip, that runner provided traction. It provided safety. Now I was looking at 30 feet of ice. I took a tentative step, the rubber tip of my cane squeaking against the wood. I felt unsteady immediately. My socks slipped slightly, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself. "Careful, Matilda." I jumped. Sienna was standing at the end of the hall holding a stack of my linen towels. She was wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my first car, and she looked annoyingly fresh for 7 in the morning. "Where is the rug?" I asked, my voice raspy with sleep. "Oh, good morning," she said, breezing toward me. We rolled it up. It was practically threadbare in the middle, and the edges were curling up. It was a massive trip hazard. "You really should thank us. A fall on that thing would have sent you right back to the hospital." I felt a flush of anger. That rug was pinned down. It has never curled in 40 years. "I cannot walk on this floor, Sienna. It is too slippery." She tutted, shaking her head as if dealing with a petulant child. "Nonsense. You just need to pick up your feet. Besides, cleaner lines are better for mental clarity. Clutter in the home equals clutter in the mind." She walked past me into the bathroom, and I heard her start opening cabinets. I took a deep breath and navigated the hallway, moving inch by inch, terrified that my cane would slide out from under me. It took me twice as long to reach the stairs. When I finally made it to the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee assaulted my nose. I never drank coffee. I drank tea. But the aroma of dark roast filled the room, masking the subtle scent of the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Caleb was sitting at my kitchen table, or rather, he was sitting at a table that was in my kitchen, but it was not arranged the way I left it. The table had been rotated 90 degrees. It blocked the direct path to the back door, the path to the greenhouses. "Morning, Aunt Mattie," he said, not looking up from his phone. There was a half-eaten bagel on a plate in front of him. "Sleep well." I ignored him and went to the cupboard to get my favorite mug. It was a ceramic piece hand thrown by a local artist, heavy and textured, easy for my arthritic fingers to grip. I opened the cabinet door. It was empty. I opened the next one. Empty. "Where are my mugs, Caleb?" He finally looked up, blinking. "Oh, the old mismatched ones. We boxed those up for goodwill. They were all chipped and stained, Maddie. Unhygienic, really. We bought a new set. Top shelf." I looked up. On the highest shelf, completely out of my reach, were rows of sleek white porcelain cups. They had no handles. They were those modern, minimalist tumblers that looked like eggs. "I cannot reach those," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I cannot hold a cup without a handle." "My hands shake, Caleb. You know this." Sienna breezed into the kitchen, then carrying a vase of fresh-cut flowers. "My flowers." She had cut blooms from the front garden perennials that were not meant to be cut. "I'll get it for you, Matilda," she said, reaching up effortlessly and grabbing one of the white eggs. She placed it on the counter. "There. See? Much more elegant." I stared at the cup. It was an act of war disguised as home improvement. They were stripping away my ability to function independently, one cup and one rug at a time. "I am going outside," I said, turning away from the counter. "I need to check the greenhouses." Caleb stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "Not yet, Maddie. Eat something first. You need your strength." "I am not hungry. I need to check the midnight azure. The humidity sensors are sensitive. If they drifted overnight, the buds will drop." I tried to move toward the back door, but the table was in the way. I had to shuffle sideways, squeezing between the chair and the counter. It was humiliating. Caleb sighed and followed me. "You are obsessed with those plants, Maddie. It's unhealthy." I pushed open the back door and the cold air hit me. I didn't care. I moved as fast as my cane would allow across the patio and down the paved path to the main glasshouse. As I got closer, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Something was wrong. The glasshouse was usually a living, breathing thing. Even from the outside, you could hear the low hum of the industrial humidifiers and the rhythmic whir of the circulation fans. It was the heartbeat of the nursery. But today, there was silence. Absolute dead silence. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers trembling uncontrollably now. I shoved the door open and stepped inside. The air was wrong. It should have been thick and heavy, tropical and warm. Instead, it was dry. The crisp autumn air from outside was seeping in, and the heat was gone. I looked at the control panel on the wall. The digital display was dark. "Who turned this off?" I screamed. The sound tore out of my throat, raw and terrified. Caleb walked in behind me, his hands in his pockets. He looked around casually. "Oh, that. Yeah, I flipped the breaker last night." "You what?" I stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. "You turned off the life support system for $5 million worth of inventory. Why would you do that?" Caleb shrugged, kicking at a loose pebble on the floor. "Do you have any idea how much electricity these things pull, Maddie? I was looking at your bills last night. It's insane. Thousands a month just to keep some flowers warm. We're tightening the belt. You're on a fixed income now." "They are not flowers," I hissed, stepping toward him, raising my cane. "These are rare tropical hybrids. They need 70% humidity and a constant temperature of 75 degrees. You have killed them, Caleb. One night of cold shock can stunt them for years." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "They look fine to me. Stop being so dramatic. It's just plants. Nature is tough, right? They can handle a little fresh air." I turned away from him, frantically flipping switches on the breaker panel. The lights flickered back on. The fans groaned into life. The humidifiers started to hiss. But as I looked down the row of benches, my heart broke. The leaves of the vandas were already looking dull, and in the far corner, the specialized enclosure for the midnight azure looked dark. I limped over to it. The midnight azure was the result of 20 years of genetic selection. It was a deep, iridescent blue orchid that glowed in low light. It was my legacy. I peered through the glass of its individual chamber. The condensation that should have coated the glass was gone. The delicate fern-like leaves were curled slightly at the edges. It wasn't dead, but it was stressed. Deeply stressed. I turned back to Caleb. "You are not to touch anything in here again. Do you understand me? This is my business. This is my house." Caleb's face changed. The mask of the concerned nephew slipped just a fraction. His eyes went hard. "It's not a business anymore, Maddie," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a hobby. A very expensive hobby that is draining your estate. Sienna and I are just trying to stop the bleeding. You're confused. You're spending money you don't have on things that don't matter." "I have plenty of money," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you?" he asked softly. "Are you sure about that? Have you checked your accounts lately?" Or have you just been playing in the dirt while the world moved on without you? He stepped closer, looming over me. We're doing this for your own good. We're going to streamline things. Simplify. You don't need 3 greenhouses. You don't need all this equipment. You just need to rest. He reached out and gently flipped the switch on the wall next to me. The humidifiers died again. The silence rushed back in. Leave it off, Maddie, he said. That's an order. We're not paying for it. He turned and walked out, leaving me standing in the drying, cooling air of my dying sanctuary. I looked at the midnight azure, and I saw my own reflection in the glass. I looked old. I looked small. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly afraid. The night was long and filled with the restless turning of a mind that could not find purchase on reality. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the old sash windows, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. My hip throbbed a low, dull ache that radiated down to my knee, but the pain in my chest was far worse. It was the pain of helplessness. I had spent 72 years building a fortress of solitude and expertise, and in the span of 48 hours, it had been breached by 2 people who saw my life work as nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 5 times. The house was silent. The heavy, rhythmic snoring of Caleb drifted down from the guest suite down the hall. He slept the sleep of the entitled. I moved slowly, swinging my legs out of bed and reaching for my cane. I did not turn on the light. I knew this room by heart, or at least I thought I did, until I remembered the rearranged furniture, and I paused, letting my eyes adjust to the gray pre-dawn gloom. I had to get to the greenhouse. I had to turn the humidifiers back on. I had laid awake all night, calculating the rate of moisture loss in the dry autumn air. The midnight azure was hardy, but it was entering its blooming cycle. Stress now would not just delay the bloom, it could cause the plant to abort the flower spike entirely. 5 years of waiting would be lost. I dressed in the dark, pulling on a thick wool cardigan over my nightgown. I skipped the stairs, taking the service elevator I had installed 5 years ago, when my knees first started to complain. It moved silently, a ghost in the walls. When the doors opened into the pantry, I held my breath, listening for any movement from the kitchen. Silence. I moved across the kitchen floor, navigating around the barricade of the misplaced table, and slipped out the back door. The cold morning air hit me like a slap. It was misty, a thick white fog that rolled off the nearby river and obscured the bottom of the garden. The greenhouse loomed ahead, a gray skeleton in the mist. I reached the door and fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking. They always shook a little in the morning, a familial tremor that I usually controlled with beta blockers and breathing exercises. But this morning, the shaking was violent. It was rage. It was fear. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence was still there, but the air felt slightly warmer. The solar gain from the previous day had trapped some heat, but the dryness was palpable. I could feel it in my sinuses. I walked down the central aisle, scanning the benches. The phalaenopsis looked sad, their leaves drooping slightly, but they would recover. The cattleyas were tough, leathery things. They were fine. Then I saw it. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. On the center bench, which I reserved for my prized specimens, sat the pot of Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, the king of orchids. It was a majestic plant that I had nurtured from a seedling for 15 years. It was currently in spike, holding 3 magnificent burgundy and gold-striped flowers that were the envy of the botanical world. Or it had been. The main stem, the thick, fleshy stalk that held the blooms, was snapped. It wasn't withered. It wasn't brown from rot. It was snapped clean in half, hanging by a single thread of green fiber. The flowers lay face down on the gravel bench like fallen soldiers. I let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. I dropped my cane and rushed forward, grabbing the edge of the bench to support myself. I reached out with trembling fingers to touch the wound. The break was jagged. It was fresh. Sap was still oozing from the tear, glistening in the low light. This was not natural causes. A stem this thick does not just break. Force had been applied. Significant, clumsy force. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Oh my God, Matilda." The voice came from the shadows near the potting shed at the back of the greenhouse. I spun around, nearly losing my balance. Caleb stepped out of the gloom. He was wearing a thick coat and holding a steaming mug of coffee. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked resigned. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Look at this, Caleb. Look at what you did." I pointed a shaking finger at the broken orchid. Caleb walked over slowly, sipping his coffee. He looked at the plant, and then he looked at me. His face was a mask of pity. "I didn't do this, Maddie," he said softly. "You did." I stared at him. The air left my lungs. I would never. I would sooner cut off my own hand. "This is a Rothschildianum, Caleb. Do you know what this is?" "I know it's a plant," he said, setting his mug down on the bench, right next to a delicate fern crushing its fronds. "And I know I found you down here at 2 a.m, wandering around in your nightgown." I recoiled. "That is a lie. I was in bed. I was awake all night listening to you snore." "Were you?" he asked, tilting his head. "Or do you just think you were?" "I came down here because I saw the lights on. You were standing right here, Maddie. You were thrashing around with your cane trying to reach the vents. You were shouting about the heat. I tried to get you to stop, but you swung your cane and, well." He gestured to the broken stem. I stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth. No, that is not true. That never happened." "Look at your hands, Maddie," Caleb said, his voice dropping to that gentle, patronizing tone that was sharper than any knife. "Look at them." I looked down. My hands were vibrating against my chest. The tremors were uncontrollable now. "You can't even hold a spoon steady at breakfast," he continued. "Is it so hard to believe that you lost your balance in the dark? That you flailed out and hit something? You're confused, Maddie. The surgery, the anesthesia, the pain meds, it's messing with your head." I closed my eyes tight. I tried to replay the night. I remembered the bed. I remembered the clock. But his voice was so confident, so certain. Was it possible? Had I sleepwalked? No, I knew I hadn't. I knew it in my bones. But the doubt, the tiny seed of doubt, had been planted. "You broke it," I said, opening my eyes and glaring at him. "You broke it to hurt me, to prove I can't do this anymore." Caleb sighed a long, suffering sound. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I didn't want to bring this up yet," he said, smoothing the paper out on the bench. "I wanted to wait until you were stronger. But after last night, after this, I think we need to be realistic." He pushed the paper toward me. It was thick legal stock. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Durable power of attorney." "What is this?" I whispered. "It's just a safety net," Caleb said. "It gives me the authority to handle the heavy lifting. The bills, the maintenance, the contractors. It lets me make decisions when you're having a bad day. Like today." I looked at the document. It was a surrender treaty. It was the end of my life. I will not sign that, I said, backing away. I am of sound mind. I am simply old, and I have a bad hip. That does not make me incompetent. Caleb picked up the broken flower head from the gravel. He twirled it between his fingers, watching the expensive petals bruise. You destroyed your prized possession, Maddie, he said quietly. And you don't even remember doing it. If that's not incompetence, I don't know what is. What if next time it's not a flower? What if you leave the gas on? What if you fall and no one is here? He took a step toward me, holding the paper out like a weapon. Sienna and I are worried about you. We're terrified, actually. If you don't let us help you, if you don't sign this so we can legally protect you, we might have to look at other options. Other options. The phrase hung in the damp air. Homes, Caleb said. Facilities. Places where they can watch you 24/7. I don't want that. You don't want that. This house is your legacy. Sign the paper, Maddie, and you get to stay in your garden. We'll hire a manager to do the physical work. You can just sit and watch. I looked at the broken stem again. The sap was starting to dry. My heart felt like it was cracking right along with it. I need to think, I said, turning toward the door. I need to call my lawyer. Caleb laughed softly. The phone is still down, Maddie. And honestly, if you call a lawyer in this state, shaking, confused, accusing your family of sabotaging flowers, they're going to side with me. They're going to see a sweet old lady who is losing her grip. He was right. I looked down at my trembling hands. I looked like a victim. I looked weak. Leave the paper. I said, my voice hollow. Just leave it. Caleb smiled, a genuine warm smile that didn't reach his shark-like eyes. Good girl. I'll leave a pen. Take your time. I'll go make some fresh coffee. Not that instant stuff you drink. Real coffee. He patted my shoulder as he walked past me. I flinched, but I didn't pull away. I waited until the door closed behind him, until I was alone with my broken children. Then I sank to my knees on the dirty floor. The cold damp seeped through my nightgown, but I didn't care. I picked up the fallen flower head of the Rothschildianum. It was still beautiful, even in death. I didn't do this, I whispered to the plant. I promise you I didn't do this. But as I stared at the jagged green wound, a terrifying thought wormed its way into my mind. What if I did? What if he was right? What if my mind was betraying me, just like my hip had? I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I needed my notebook. I needed to write this down. I needed to record the time and the temperature and the nature of the break. I was a scientist. I dealt in data. My hand brushed against something hard and plastic in my pocket. It was a cap. A small blue plastic cap. I pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was the cap from a spray bottle. But not one of my spray bottles. My bottles were all color-coded industrial sprayers with white nozzles. This was a cheap blue cap from a grocery store cleaner. I looked at the bench where the orchid had sat. There in the gravel, just partially hidden by the pot, was a faint blue stain. I leaned down and sniffed. Ammonia. It wasn't a strong smell, but to a nose trained to detect subtle shifts in soil chemistry, it was unmistakable. Someone had sprayed the stem with a freezing agent or a chemical hardener to make it brittle before snapping it. I gripped the blue cap in my hand until the plastic bit into my palm. I hadn't done this. I stood up, using the bench to hoist myself. My knees cracked and my hip screamed, but I stood tall. The trembling in my hands didn't stop, but the trembling in my heart did. Caleb had made a mistake. He was arrogant. He thought I was just a senile old woman who played with flowers. He didn't realize that a botanist observes everything. He had left debris at the crime scene. I looked at the power of attorney document sitting on the bench. I wanted to tear it into confetti, but I couldn't. Not yet. If I fought him openly now, he would escalate. He would find a way to drug me or hurt me before I could get help. I needed to play the game. I needed to be the confused old lady he wanted me to be. I took the blue cap and tucked it deep into my bra right next to my skin. It was my evidence. It was my anchor. I picked up the pen Caleb had left. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen. I looked at the signature line on the document. I wouldn't sign it. Not today. But I would make him think I was close. I would make him think he had won so that he would get sloppy. I turned and limped out of the greenhouse, leaving the broken orchid behind as a sacrifice. I walked back up the path toward the house, my head bowed, my pace slow and shuffling. From the kitchen window, I saw Sienna watching me. She was holding a mug of coffee and smiling. Let them smile. Let them think the roots are rotting. They don't know that the strongest growth happens in the dark. The weather report on the television was calling it a killing frost. I sat in my wingback chair in the library with a blanket tucked around my legs and watched the weatherman gesture frantically at a map of the county that was turning a deep, ominous blue. It was going to be the coldest night of the year so far, with temperatures dropping well below freezing by midnight. In a normal year, I would have been out there all evening checking the seals on the glasshouse doors and double-checking the backup generator and wrapping the outdoor pipes with burlap. But this was not a normal year. This was the year of the occupation. Caleb and Sienna were in the living room across the hall. I could hear the clinking of wine glasses and the low murmur of their voices interspersed with bursts of laughter. They were celebrating something. Perhaps they thought my hesitation over the power of attorney document was a sign of surrender. They did not know about the blue plastic cap burning a hole in my pocket, or the cold fury that was hardening in my chest like ice. I looked at the digital weather station I kept on the mantle. The outdoor sensor, which was mounted inside the main glasshouse, read 72 degrees. Perfect. The heaters were humming, and the thermal curtains I had installed 5 years ago would have deployed automatically at sunset. I picked up my book and pretended to read. It was a dense, botanical text on the propagation of epiphytes, but my eyes never moved past the first paragraph. I was listening. I was waiting. Around 10 o'clock, the house went quiet. I heard Caleb and Sienna go upstairs. I heard the bathroom water run and then the heavy thud of their bedroom door closing. I waited another 30 minutes to be sure. The wind was howling outside now, battering against the old stone walls of the manor. It was a restless, angry wind. I looked at the weather station again. 68 degrees. I frowned. A 4-degree drop in half an hour was unusual, but not impossible given the wind chill. The heaters would kick into high gear soon to compensate. I watched the numbers. 65. My stomach tightened. The heaters should have stabilized it by now. The differential was getting too wide. 60. I stood up, throwing the blanket aside. Something was wrong. The heaters were powerful enough to maintain tropical conditions in a blizzard, unless they weren't running. I grabbed my cane and moved as fast as I could to the kitchen. The house was dark, and the shadows stretched out like long fingers across the floor. I reached the back door, the one that led directly to the patio and the path to the greenhouses. I reached for the brass handle and turned it. It wouldn't move. I twisted harder, ignoring the pain in my arthritic wrist. It was locked, but that was impossible. I never locked the back door until I did my final rounds. I turned the deadbolt latch. It clicked freely. The lock mechanism was open, but the door itself was immovable. I put my shoulder against the wood and shoved. It felt solid, like it had been welded to the frame. Panic started to rise in my throat. I looked out the window in the top of the door. The patio lights were off, but the moon was full and bright, reflecting off the frost that was already coating the lawn. The glass house was dark. Usually you could see the faint orange glow of the heating elements reflecting off the glass, but tonight it was a black void. I turned and ran, or hobbled as fast as I could to the side door in the laundry room. I fumbled with the lock and threw it open. A wedge of wood had been jammed under the handle on the outside. I stared at it. It was a simple doorstop, hammered into the gap between the door and the frame. I couldn't push the door out. I was trapped. I ran back to the kitchen and pounded on the window. Caleb, wake up. There was no answer. The house was silent except for the wind. I looked at the weather station on the kitchen wall. 52 degrees. My tropicals could survive 50 degrees for a few hours, but the midnight azure was in a critical budding phase. Below 55, the chemical process that created the blue pigment would stop. Below 45, the cells would rupture. I needed to get out there. I needed to manually override the breaker. I needed to wrap the pots in fleece. I went to the library window. It was a sash window, old and heavy. I undid the latch and tried to lift it. It moved an inch and then stopped with a metallic clunk. I looked closely. A small nail had been driven into the track. I was a prisoner in my own home. I sank into the chair by the window and pressed my face against the cold glass. I had to watch. I had no choice. The temperature on the sensor continued to drop. 48, 45, 40. At 40 degrees, I knew the condensation on the inside of the glasshouse would be freezing. I imagined the frost creeping across the leaves of my cattleyas, turning their lush green flesh into black mush. I imagined the midnight azure shivering in its pot, the delicate spike withering. I pounded on the ceiling with my cane. Caleb, Sienna, help me! I screamed until my throat was raw. I banged the cane against the floor until the wood splintered. Nothing. They were either in a coma or they were lying in bed listening to me scream, smiling at the ceiling. I sat there for hours. I watched the sensor hit 32 degrees. Freezing. Tears streamed down my face, but I made no sound. I was mourning. I was mourning the death of organisms that had been alive longer than Caleb had been born. I was mourning the loss of the trust I had placed in family. Around 4 a.m, the temperature stabilized at 28 degrees. The interior of the glasshouse was now a refrigerator. I didn't move from the window until the sun began to rise. The gray light of dawn revealed the carnage. The glass of the greenhouse was white with frost on the inside. At 7 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, slow footsteps. Caleb walked into the kitchen yawning and scratching his stomach. He wore pajama pants and a t-shirt that said, "World's Best Uncle," which felt like a cruel joke. He looked at me, sitting by the window, wrapped in my blanket, my eyes red and swollen. "Morning, Aunt Mattie," he said cheerfully. "Chilly one last night, huh?" I slept like a log. It's great sleeping weather. I stood up slowly. Every joint in my body ached. "Open the back door," I whispered. He frowned. "What?" "Open the back door." "Caleb, it is stuck." He looked confused. "Stuck? It shouldn't be. He walked over to the door and grabbed the handle. He gave it a little jiggle, and then he pulled. The door opened effortlessly. He turned to me with a look of mock concern. See? Opens fine. You probably just didn't turn the handle all the way, Maddie. Your wrists are getting weak, remember? I walked past him. I didn't look at him. If I looked at him, I would have clawed his eyes out, and that would not help me. I needed to be calm. I needed to be the scientist surveying the damage. I stepped out onto the patio. The air was freezing. The grass crunched under my slippers. I walked down the path to the glass house. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of rot, which is sweet and cloying. It was the smell of cooked spinach. It was the smell of plant cells that had burst and were leaking their chlorophyll into the air. It was silent. The heaters were stone cold. The breaker on the wall had been tripped. I walked down the aisle. It was a massacre. The vandas hanging from the ceiling were black and slimy. Their leaves hung like dead, wet rags. The ferns were brown and crispy. The floor was covered in dropped leaves. I reached the end of the aisle, the enclosure for the midnight azure. I was afraid to look. I closed my eyes for a second, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Please, please let it be alive. I opened the enclosure. The plant looked gray. The vibrant green leaves were dull and limp. The flower spike, the one that held the promise of the first bloom, was bent over like a shepherd's crook. I reached out and touched a leaf. It felt cold and clammy. It wasn't dead. Not yet. The core of the plant, the pseudobulb, was still firm. But it was in shock. Deep thermal shock. It would take months, maybe years to recover. And the bloom was gone. The flower spike turned to mush between my fingers. I heard footsteps behind me. "Oh, wow," Caleb said. His voice was flat, devoid of any real emotion. "Looks like the frost got in." "That's a shame." I turned slowly. The heaters were off, Caleb. The breaker was tripped. He shrugged. "Old wiring, Maddie. I told you, this place is a money pit. The system probably overloaded when it tried to kick on against the cold." "It's a sign." "A sign," I repeated. "Yeah, a sign that it's time to let go. Look at this mess. Everything is dead. It's going to cost thousands to replace all this. And for what? So you can look at pretty flowers." He kicked a dead orchid leaf across the floor. "We should just clear it all out. Sienna knows a guy who buys scrap glass. We could tear these structures down and put in a nice lawn. Low maintenance. Safer for you." I looked at him. I really looked at him. He was enjoying this. He was feeding on my devastation. He thought he had broken me. He thought that by killing my plants, he was killing my spirit. He was wrong. He had just pruned me. And any gardener knows that when you prune something back hard, it grows back stronger. "You are right, Caleb," I said, my voice trembling, not with age, but with the effort of holding back my rage. "It is a mess. I am overwhelmed." He smiled and put an arm around my shoulders. "See? I knew you'd see reason. Come on, let's go inside. Sienna made pancakes. We can call that lawyer today. Get that paperwork sorted so you don't have to worry about breakers and heaters anymore." I let him lead me out of the graveyard. "I will clean this up later," I said. "Don't bother," he said. "We'll hire some guys to haul it all to the dump." We walked back to the house. As we passed the laundry room door, I glanced at the frame. There was a fresh indentation in the wood, a mark where a wedge had been hammered in. I stumbled slightly, and Caleb caught me. "Careful now," he said. "Don't want you falling." I leaned into him, letting him take my weight. "Thank you, Caleb," I said. "You are so good to me." I needed him to believe it. I needed him to think I was defeated. Because if he thought I was defeated, he would stop watching me so closely. And I needed him to stop watching me. Because I had to find a way to get the midnight azure out of here. It was alive, but it wouldn't survive another night in this house. I needed Elias. I needed help. And I needed to stop drinking the tea. We entered the kitchen. Sienna was at the stove flipping pancakes. She looked up and smiled a bright, predatory smile. "How are the flowers, Matilda?" she asked. "They are gone," I said, sinking into a chair. "All gone." "Oh, that's terrible," she said, pouring batter into the pan. "But maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Now you can focus on yourself." She placed a mug of tea in front of me. It smelled of bergamot and something else. Something bitter. "Drink up," she said. "It will make you feel better." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. "Thank you, Sienna," I said. "You are too kind." I lifted the cup to my lips and pretended to sip, but I didn't swallow. I held the liquid in my mouth, waiting for the moment when she turned her back so I could spit it into the napkin in my lap. The war had moved from the garden to the kitchen, and I was done losing. I spent the morning moving through the house like a ghost in my own life. I dragged my feet. I let my hand tremble when I reached for the butter dish. I allowed my gaze to drift vacantly out the window whenever Caleb spoke to me. It was a performance worthy of the stage, and it was exhausting. Beneath the wool cardigan and the hunched posture, my muscles were coiled tight with adrenaline. I had not swallowed the tea at breakfast. I had spit it into a paper napkin when Sienna turned to check the toast, and that soggy ball of paper was now decomposing in the compost bin under the sink, hidden beneath a layer of potato peelings. Without the sedative fogging my brain, I was painfully aware of everything. I heard the whispered conversations in the hallway. I saw the way Sienna looked at the silver candlesticks in the dining room, evaluating their weight and their worth. But mostly, I was aware of the silence from the outside world. I needed to see my accounts. Caleb had mentioned bills. He had mentioned the cost of electricity. I knew for a fact that my operating account had a healthy balance. I had just sold a rare Phalaenopsis hybrid to a collector in Japan for $6,000 3 weeks ago. There should have been plenty of liquidity. I found Caleb in my study. He was sitting at my mahogany desk, his feet propped up on the leather blotter. He was typing on his laptop, the rapid-fire clack of the keys echoing in the room. "Caleb," I said, keeping my voice thin and reedy. He jumped, swinging his legs down. He slammed the laptop shut a little too quickly. "Jesus, Maddie, you startled me. You're quiet today." "I am just tired," I said, leaning heavily on my cane. The grief over the plants. It takes a toll." He nodded, putting on his sympathetic face. "Of course. It's a big loss. That's why Sienna and I are handling things. You shouldn't be worrying about anything." I shuffled into the room. I was thinking about the cleanup. If we are going to hire men to clear out the dead plants, I need to write a check. I should check the balance in the business account, just to be sure. Caleb waved a hand. "Don't worry about it. I'll cover it for now. We can settle up later." "No," I insisted, taking a step closer. "I prefer to pay my own way. It is a point of pride, Caleb." "Please, let me log in." I reached for the mouse of my desktop computer, which sat on the corner of the desk. The screen was black. I tapped the spacebar. Nothing happened. Caleb sighed. "You can't, Maddie. The internet is down." "Down?" I repeated, looking at the dark screen. "Yeah. Storm knocked it out last night. Same thing that tripped the breaker in the greenhouse, probably. The router is fried. I've been on hold with the provider for an hour on my cell. They said it might be a few days before they can get a tech out here." I looked at him. He was lying. I could tell by the way he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "But you were typing," I said, pointing to his laptop. "Offline work," he said quickly. "Spreadsheets. Just crunching numbers locally. No connection needed." I looked over at the modem, which sat on the bookshelf behind him. It was a black box with a row of small LED lights. They were blinking. Green. 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 If the internet was down, the lights would be red or orange. Green meant a connection. Green meant the signal was flowing through the fiber optic cables, pulsing with information from the outside world. "I see," I said. "That is unfortunate. I suppose I will have to wait." "Exactly," Caleb said, relaxing. "Just wait. Go read a book. Or better yet, take a nap. You look pale." I turned and walked out of the study. My heart was hammering against my ribs. He had changed the password on my computer. Or he had simply unplugged the Ethernet cable from the back of the tower. He was cutting me off. I climbed the stairs one painful step at a time. If the house internet was compromised, I still had my tablet. It was an older model, an iPad I used for cataloging my collection, but it had a cellular data plan. I kept it on my bedside table next to my reading glasses. It was my lifeline. I reached my bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. The house felt like it was shrinking, closing in around me. I walked to the nightstand. The glasses were there. The lamp was there. The stack of books was there. The tablet was gone. I blinked, thinking perhaps I had moved it. I checked the drawer. Empty, except for a few cough drops and a notepad. I checked under the bed. I checked the bathroom. It was nowhere. Panic started to rise again, sharp and acrid. I needed that tablet. I needed to email Elias. I needed to check my bank balance to see if they had already started draining the funds. I walked out into the hall. Sienna was coming out of the guest room carrying a basket of laundry. "Sienna," I called out. She stopped smiling, that tight, practiced smile. "Yes, Matilda. Do you need something? I cannot find my tablet. The white one. It was on my nightstand this morning." "Oh, that," she said, adjusting the basket on her hip. "I saw you with it earlier. You took it downstairs, didn't you?" "No," I said firmly. "I did not. I have not used it today." Sienna tilted her head. "Are you sure?" "I could have sworn I saw you walking around with it. You probably set it down somewhere and forgot. Like the other day with your glasses. Remember you left them in the refrigerator? I had not left my glasses in the refrigerator. Sienna had put them there. I knew this now with absolute certainty. I did not take it downstairs. I said, my voice rising. It was here. Someone has moved it. "Matilda, listen to yourself," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're getting agitated. It's just a screen. You don't need it. What would you even look at? You're upset about the flowers and you're lashing out." "I am not lashing out," I said. "I am looking for my property." She sighed, putting the basket down. "Okay, let's look. Where do you think you put it?" She walked past me into my bedroom. She opened the closet door. She looked under the pillows. She made a show of searching, all the while glancing at me with pity. "It's not here, Matilda. You must have hidden it." "Hidden it? Why would I hide it?" "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "Paranoia, maybe. You've been acting very strange lately. Very suspicious. Maybe you put it somewhere safe and just blanked. It happens. My grandmother used to hide her dentures in the toaster oven." She laughed, a light tinkling sound that made me want to scream. I stood in the middle of the room, my hands clenched into fists. I knew what they were doing. It is called gaslighting. I had read about it in a magazine. They were trying to make me doubt my own reality, so that when the time came to sign the papers, I would believe I was incompetent. "I will look downstairs," I said, turning away. "You do that," Sienna said, picking up her laundry. "And if you don't find it, maybe it's a sign that you should take a break from technology. It overstimulates the brain, you know. Bad for the nerves." I watched her walk down the hall. As she turned the corner, I saw something in the laundry basket. Tucked between a towel and a sheet was a rectangular shape. It was the outline of a tablet. I almost called out. I almost ran after her and ripped it from the basket, but I stopped. If I confronted her, she would just say she found it downstairs. She would say I left it on the sofa. She would spin it into another proof of my decline, and she would keep it. She would say she was holding it for safekeeping. I needed to be smarter. I went back into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I was trapped. No phone, no computer, no tablet, no car keys. I looked at the window. The sky was gray and heavy. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think like a botanist. When a plant is cut off from its primary water source, it sends out seeking roots. It finds another way. I had one other way. My old business partner, Elias, he came by once a month to deliver specialized fertilizer supplies. He was due next Tuesday. That was 4 days away. Could I last 4 days? I looked at the door. I looked at the emptiness of the room. I had to, but I needed to know what they were doing with the money. If they drained the accounts before Tuesday, there would be nothing left to save. I remembered the mail. The mailman came at 11 o'clock. He drove a small white van, and he put the letters in the box at the end of the driveway. Usually Caleb brought the mail in. He filtered it. I hadn't seen a bank statement or a utility bill in 2 weeks. I looked at the clock. It was 10:45. I stood up. I smoothed my cardigan. I picked up my cane. I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. I could hear Sienna in the laundry room, the washing machine filling with water. I could hear Caleb in the study still typing. I moved to the stairs. I didn't take the elevator. The elevator made a noise. The stairs, if you stayed close to the wall, were silent. I went down 1 step at a time. My hips screamed, but I bit my lip and kept moving. I reached the foyer. The front door was right there. I opened it slowly, wincing at the click of the latch. The cold air rushed in. I stepped out onto the porch. The driveway was long, a 1/4 mile of gravel winding through the oaks. I couldn't walk that far. Not fast enough. If they saw me, they would stop me. But I didn't need to walk to the box. I just needed to intercept the van. I moved to the side of the porch, hiding behind a large stone pillar covered in dead ivy. I waited. 10 minutes passed. My fingers were numb. Then I heard it. The low rumble of the mail van. It came up the drive, stopping at the box. The mailman, a young man named Gary, leaned out and shoved a stack of envelopes into the metal box. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I waved my cane. "Gary." He looked up, startled. He saw me standing on the porch in the freezing wind. "Mrs. Galloway," he called out, leaning out the window. "You okay?" "Please," I hissed, putting a finger to my lips. "Bring the mail here, to the door." He frowned, but he put the van in gear and drove up to the porch. He hopped out, holding the stack of letters. "You look frozen, Mrs. G," he said. "You shouldn't be out here without a coat." "Give it to me," I said, reaching out with a shaking hand. "Please, Gary, just give it to me." He handed me the stack. I flipped through it quickly. Junk mail. Junk mail. Catalog. And then I saw it. A thin envelope from the First National Bank. And another one from the power company. "Thank you," I whispered. I shoved the important envelopes down the front of my dress inside my bra, right next to the blue plastic cap. "Mrs. Galloway, are you sure you're all right?" Gary asked, looking at me with concern. "You look scared." "I am fine, Gary. Just don't tell anyone you gave me this. It is a surprise. For my nephew." He looked doubtful, but he nodded. "All right. You take care now." He got back in the van and drove away. I turned to go back inside. The front door opened. Caleb stood there. He looked at the mail van driving away. He looked at the stack of junk mail in my hand. "What are you doing, Maddie?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I froze. I clutched the junk mail to my chest. I wanted to get some fresh air," I stammered. "And Gary was here. I thought I would save you the trip." Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He reached out and took the stack of mail from my hand. He flipped through it. "Catalog, pizza coupon, insurance offer." He looked at me. "Is this it?" "Yes," I lied. My heart was beating against the hidden envelopes. "That is all." He stared at me for a long moment. His eyes were cold, searching. "You shouldn't be out here, Maddie," he said. "You could slip. And then where would we be?" He took my arm and pulled me inside. He closed the door and locked it. He put the deadbolt on. "Next time, just ask," he said. "I'll get the mail. That's what I'm here for." He walked into the kitchen, tossing the junk mail into the trash. I stood in the foyer, feeling the sharp corners of the bank statement digging into my skin. It was uncomfortable. It was painful. And it was the best thing I had felt in days. I had a secret. I had information. I turned and walked to the stairs. "I am going to nap now, Caleb," I called out. "Good idea," he yelled back. I went to my room and locked the door. I went into the bathroom and turned on the tap so the running water would mask the sound of tearing paper. I pulled the envelope out and ripped it open. I looked at the balance. I gasped. The balance was there, but there was a pending transaction, a transfer scheduled for tomorrow. Recipient, CNS Holdings, LLC. Amount, $50,000. It wasn't everything, but it was the start. They were testing the waters. I looked at the date. Tomorrow. I didn't have until Tuesday. I didn't have 4 days. I had 24 hours. I flushed the envelope pieces down the toilet. I watched them swirl away. The digital wall was high and thick, but I had found a crack. Now I just had to figure out how to widen it before they cemented me in for good. The bank statement burned against my skin like a brand. $50,000. It was a staggering sum to move in a single day, and if they succeeded, it would only be the beginning. Once the floodgates were open, they would drain the reservoir of my life until there was nothing left but silt and regret. I sat on the edge of my bed in the locked room and listened to the silence of the house. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that falls before a thunderstorm. I knew I could not stay in the room. Hiding was no longer a strategy. It was a slow death. I needed to get to the village. It was a 3-mile walk to the town center, where Mr. Henderson, my attorney, had his office above the bakery. 3 miles was a marathon for a woman with a new hip and a cane, but I calculated the risks. If I stayed, I would lose everything. If I walked, I might fall. I might freeze. I might collapse in a ditch, but at least I would be fighting. I waited until the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The house was quiet. I assumed Caleb was in the study engrossed in his fraudulent spreadsheets, and Sienna was likely in the bath as I could hear the distant rumble of the plumbing. I dressed in my warmest layers. thermal leggings under my wool trousers, a silk blouse, a heavy cable knit sweater, and my tweed coat. I wrapped a scarf around my neck and pulled on my gloves. I looked like I was preparing for an expedition to the Arctic, but the wind outside was biting, and my blood ran thin these days. I unlocked my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a betrayal of wood against its master. I froze, waiting for a door to open. Nothing. I moved to the stairs, gripping the banister with both hands. I descended sideways, one step at a time, minimizing the impact on my hip. The foyer below was empty. The front door beckoned to me, a rectangle of possibility. I reached the bottom of the stairs and made for the door. My hand was inches from the brass knob when a voice floated out from the living room. "Going somewhere, Matilda." I stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I turned slowly. Sienna was sitting in the high-backed armchair near the fireplace. She wasn't in the bath. She was waiting. She had a book in her lap, but it was closed. "I am going for a walk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The air in here is stale. I need to breathe." Sienna stood up. She was wearing a long velvet dress that made her look like a darker, younger version of the lady of the manor. She walked toward me, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "It is freezing out there, Matilda. Caleb says it's going to drop below 20 tonight. You are not dressed for a hike." "I am dressed warmly enough," I said, gripping my cane. "I will just go to the end of the driveway and back." She stepped between me and the door. She was taller than me, and she used it. She loomed. "I don't think that is a good idea. You looked so pale at lunch. And with your hip. If you slipped on the ice, no one would find you for hours. Caleb would be devastated." "Please, move, Sienna," I said, summoning every ounce of authority I had left. "This is my house. I do not need permission to walk out my own front door." She smiled, a thin, tight stretching of lips over teeth. "Of course not," she said softly. "We are not your jailers, Matilda. We are your family. But we would be negligent if we let you wander off into a freeze. Tell you what, let's sit. Let's have a nice cup of tea. Warm you up. And then, if you still want to go, Caleb can drive you to the gate." I hesitated. A ride would be better. If I could get Caleb to drive me, I could claim I needed to go to the pharmacy in town. Once in town, I could make a scene. I could refuse to get back in the car. I could get to Henderson? "All right," I said, lowering my eyes. "A cup of tea. And then we go." "Perfect," she said, clapping her hands together lightly. "Go sit by the fire. I'll brew a fresh pot. I bought that special herbal blend you like. Chamomile and valerian. Very soothing." I walked into the living room and sat in my wingback chair. The fire was crackling, offering a false sense of comfort. I watched the flames licking at the logs and thought about the transfer. Tomorrow, I had less than 18 hours. Sienna returned a few minutes later with a silver tray. She had used my good china, the delicate porcelain cups painted with violets. She poured the amber liquid, and the steam rose up carrying the scent of herbs. "Here you go," she said, placing the cup on the small table beside me. "Drink it while it is hot." I looked at the tea. I was thirsty. My throat was parched from the dry air and the anxiety. I reached for the cup. Sienna stood there watching me. She didn't pour a cup for herself. "Aren't you having any?" I asked. "Oh no," she said, smoothing her dress. "I'm more of a coffee person. Besides, that blend makes me sleepy. It is powerful stuff." I lifted the cup. The steam smelled sweet, almost cloying. I took a sip. It was hot and floral, but underneath the chamomile, there was a metallic tang. A bitterness that hit the back of my tongue like a copper coin. I paused the cup halfway to the saucer. "Is there sugar in this?" I asked. "Just a spoon of honey," she said. "Why? Is it too hot?" "No," I said. "It is fine." I looked at her. Her eyes were fixed on the cup. She was willing me to drink it. If I didn't drink it, she would know I was suspicious. If I didn't drink it, she wouldn't let me leave. I had to play the game. I had to take enough to satisfy her, but not enough to disable me. I took another sip, a larger one this time. I forced myself to swallow the bitter liquid. Delicious. I lied, setting the cup down. "Finish it up," she urged. "You need the hydration." "I will," I said. "I just need to use the restroom first. All this tea?" I started to push myself up from the chair. "Sit down, Matilda," she said sharply. I looked at her. The mask had slipped. Her face was hard. "Drink the tea," she said. My heart began to race. "Why does it matter so much, Sienna? What is in it?" She laughed a harsh sound. "Don't be ridiculous. It's tea. You're being paranoid again. Just drink it and relax. Caleb wants to talk to you about the estate planning, and he wants you calm." "I am calm," I said. "Then drink." I reached for the cup again. My hand was trembling, and tea sloshed over the rim onto the saucer. I brought it to my lips. I pretended to take a large gulp, but I clamped my tongue against the roof of my mouth, holding the liquid there. I lowered the cup. "There," I said. "Happy?" Sienna nodded, looking satisfied. "Very." I grabbed a napkin and dabbed at my mouth, letting the liquid soak into the paper instead of swallowing it. I crumpled the napkin in my hand. "Now," I said, "about that drive." I went to stand up, and then the room tilted. It wasn't a subtle shift. It was a violent lurch, as if the house had been picked up and shaken. My knees buckled, and I fell back into the chair. What I gasped, grabbing the armrests. The first sip had been enough. My vision blurred at the edges, tunneling down, until Sienna was just a dark smudge in the center of the room. My tongue felt heavy in my mouth like a piece of lead. A wave of exhaustion crashed over me, pulling me down into a dark undertow. "Sienna," I slurred. "What? Did you—" Sienna didn't move. She just watched me. "It acts fast, doesn't it?" she said. Her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. "Caleb said the dosage was high, but you have built up a tolerance to the mild stuff. We needed something with a bit more kick." I tried to lift my hand to point at her to accuse her, but my arm wouldn't obey. It lay useless in my lap. "You poisoned me." "Sedated Matilda," she corrected me. "We sedated you. There is a difference. You were getting agitated. You were trying to run away. We can't have you wandering the streets telling stories to strangers." The darkness was closing in. I fought it. I tried to focus on the pain in my hip, using it as an anchor, but even the pain was fading. The phone rang. It was a sharp, piercing ring that cut through the fog. It was Caleb's cell phone. I heard him answer it in the hallway. "Hello, Mr. Henderson." "Henderson. My lawyer." I tried to scream. I tried to yell his name, but only a low moan escaped my lips. Caleb walked into the room phone, pressed to his ear. He looked at me, slumped in the chair, my head lolling to the side. He winked at Sienna. "Yes, I know we had a tentative appointment for her to call in today," Caleb said into the phone. His voice was smooth, practiced. "I am so sorry. We tried to get her to the phone, but, well, she is having a very bad day." I shook my head slowly, trying to deny it. Yes, it is. The dementia. Caleb continued, his voice dripping with faux sadness. It is progressing faster than we thought. She gets confused. She thinks people are stealing from her. She thinks the plants are talking to her. It is heartbreaking, really. Liar, I thought. You thief. So, regarding the transfer authorization? Caleb said, pacing the room. Since she is incapacitated and I have the medical proxy. Yes. Exactly. We need to secure the assets before she spends it all on. Well, on nothing. He paused, listening. Yes, Dr. Vane was here yesterday. He signed the affidavit. I can fax it over to you as soon as the internet is back up. But for the bank transfer, a verbal confirmation from the acting guardian should suffice, given the urgency, right? He looked at me. I was losing the battle. My eyes were closing against my will. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, Caleb said. You are a lifesaver. We just want what is best for Aunt Mattie. I'll make sure the funds are moved to the holding account first thing tomorrow. He hung up. He looked at Sienna. Done. Henderson bought it. The transfer is greenlit. Sienna smiled and walked over to me. She leaned down, her face inches from mine. Did you hear that, Matilda? She whispered. You are safe now. We are taking care of everything. I wanted to bite her nose. I wanted to spit in her face. But the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I felt was Sienna prying the crumpled napkin from my hand, and the last thing I heard was the sound of my own trust fund being stolen in the silence of the room. Waking up was not like surfacing from a deep sleep. It was like clawing my way out of a grave filled with wet sand. My eyelids felt like they had been glued shut, and my mouth tasted of copper and ash. I lay there for a long time, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, a heavy whooshing sound that drowned out the world. I tried to lift my head, but it felt too heavy for my neck. The ceiling spun in a slow, sickening circle. I was in my bed. I was wearing my nightgown. I had no memory of how I got there. The last thing I remembered was the fire in the living room and Sienna's face looming over me like a moon in a dark sky. I forced myself to sit up. The room tilted, and I grabbed the sheets to anchor myself. The light coming through the curtains was bright. Too bright. It was harsh and white. It wasn't morning light. It was midday light. I looked at the clock. 11:30. Panic cut through the chemical fog. 11:30. The transfer. Caleb had said he would move the money first thing in the morning. Had I slept through it? Had I slept through the theft of my life? I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet hit the floor, but I couldn't feel the wood. My extremities were numb. Matilda. The door opened, and Sienna walked in carrying a tray. She was smiling. It was a bright, cheery smile that made my stomach turn. Look who is finally awake. We were starting to get worried. You slept for 14 hours. 14 hours, I croaked. My voice was a wreck. You were exhausted, she said, setting the tray down on the bedside table. All that stress. The body shuts down when it can't handle the load. Dr. Vane said it is common with your condition. She pulled up a chair and sat down. I brought you some breakfast, toast and your tea. You need to keep your fluids up. I looked at the steaming mug. It was the same floral scent, the same cloying sweetness that hid the bitterness. I am not hungry, I said, pushing the tray away. Now, she said, her voice hardening just a fraction. You have to eat, and you have to drink. You are dehydrated. Look at your skin. It is like paper. She lifted the mug and held it out to me. Her eyes were expectant. Drink, she said. It will clear your head. I looked at her hands. They were steady. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to clasp them together in my lap. I took the mug. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers. I will drink it, I said, but I need a moment to wake up. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Sienna hesitated. She looked at the door, then back at me. 5 minutes, she said, checking her watch. But then I am coming back to make sure you finished it. We can't have you fainting again. Caleb is in the study wrapping up some paperwork. He wants to see you when you are more present. She stood up and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob. Don't try to get up, Matilda. Your legs aren't working right today. She closed the door. I waited 10 seconds. Then I moved. I didn't try to stand. I knew she was right about my legs. I slid off the bed onto the floor, dragging the mug with me. I crawled on my hands and knees across the rug. I needed to get rid of this poison. But I couldn't pour it in the bathroom sink. She would check the sink. She would smell it in the drain. I looked around the room. In the corner by the window, on a mahogany stand, sat a maidenhair fern. Adiantum radianum. It was one of the most delicate plants in my collection. Its fronds were like lace paper thin and incredibly sensitive to soil chemistry. It was the canary in the coal mine of the plant world. I pulled myself up using the stand. The fern looked lush and green. It was innocent. I am sorry, I whispered to it. I am so sorry. I tipped the mug. The amber liquid poured into the soil. It soaked in, quickly disappearing into the dark earth. I saved a tiny bit in the bottom of the cup, just enough to leave a residue. Then I crawled back to the bed and hoisted myself up. I placed the empty mug on the tray and lay back against the pillows, my heart pounding like a drum. Sienna came back 3 minutes later. She looked at the empty mug. Good girl, she said. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? She picked up the tray. You rest now. I'll come back in an hour to help you dress. She left. I lay there and waited. The fog in my brain began to lift. It was slow, like mist burning off a lake, but it was happening. The numbness in my fingers started to recede, replaced by a pins and needles tingling. My thoughts, which had been swimming in molasses, started to sharpen. I wasn't dementia. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being chemically lobotomized. I watched the fern. For an hour, nothing happened. Then around 1 o'clock, I saw the first sign. The delicate tips of the green fronds began to curl. They didn't just wilt. They turned a sickly yellow color almost instantly. The chlorosis was rapid. I watched in horror and fascination. By 2 o'clock, the entire plant had collapsed. The stems had lost their turgidity and lay flat against the pot rim. The leaves were brown and crispy, as if they had been scorched by fire. Whatever was in that tea was not just a sedative. It was a systemic toxin. A herbicide for humans. I stared at the dead plant. It had given its life to show me the truth. I wasn't just fighting for my money. I was fighting for my life. I sat up. The dizziness was gone. My legs felt weak, but they were mine again. I heard a cheer from downstairs. It was Caleb. Yes, he shouted. Yes! It went through. I froze. The transfer. I dragged myself out of bed. I grabbed my cane. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. I heard Caleb running up the stairs. He was laughing. "Sienna," he yelled. "Sienna, where are the suitcases?" Sienna came out of a room down the hall. "Did it work?" she asked. "Cleared and confirmed," he said. "The account is drained, baby. 50,000 in the first tranche. The rest follows tomorrow once the bank verifies the identity check. We are rich." I leaned against the door, closing my eyes. They had taken the first bite, but the rest was still there. The identity check gave me a window, a small, terrifying window. "We should celebrate," Sienna said. "Champagne." "Absolutely," Caleb said. "Get the bottle. I'm going to go check on the vegetable. Make sure she's still out of it. We need her groggy for the notary tomorrow." The notary. They were bringing someone in to sign the deed to the house. I backed away from the door. He was coming. I looked at the dead fern. I couldn't let him see it. If he saw the dead plant and the empty cup, he would know. I grabbed the pot. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. From rage. I shoved the pot under the bed, pushing it deep into the shadows behind a stack of shoeboxes. I scrambled back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. I let my mouth go slack. I closed my eyes halfway, letting my eyelids flutter. The door opened. Caleb walked in. He smelled of sweat and victory. "Hey, Aunt Maddie," he said loudly. I moaned a low, unintelligible sound. He walked over to the bed. He waved a hand in front of my face. I stared past him, focusing on the wall. I let a little drool escape the corner of my mouth. I played the vegetable he wanted to see. "She is totally gone," he called out to the hallway. "Lights are on, but nobody is home. That tea is magic." He patted my cheek. It was a hard, disrespectful pat. "Don't worry, Maddie," he whispered, leaning close. "You won't have to suffer much longer. Once the house is sold, we'll put you in a nice home, state-run, very economical. You'll make lots of friends." He laughed and walked out, leaving the door open. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the stairs. I waited until I heard the pop of a cork from the living room. I sat up. I wiped the drool from my mouth. State, run home. Economical, over my dead body. I swung my legs out of bed. I stood up. I was steady. The tea was in the plant, not in me. I walked to the closet. I needed something dark, something quiet, and I needed to get to the attic. Caleb thought he had cut my lines of communication. He thought the internet was the only way to talk to the world. But he forgot who lived in this house before me. My husband, Arthur. He was a radio enthusiast, a ham radio operator. And up in the attic under a dust sheet behind the old trunks was his rig. It was old technology, analog. It didn't need fiber optics. It didn't need a provider. It just needed power and a frequency. And I knew exactly who was listening on the other end. Dr. Elias Thorne, my business partner, my friend, and the president of the local amateur radio club. I dressed quickly, moving silently. I grabbed my cane. I looked at the spot where the fern had been. "Thank you," I whispered. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The celebration was getting loud downstairs. Let them drink. Let them toast their victory. The root had taken hold, but it wasn't the root of their greed. It was the root of my resistance. And it was about to break through the concrete. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows stretching out before me, and the only light came from the crack beneath the door where the attic stairs began. I could hear the party continuing downstairs. The clink of crystal against crystal and the boom of Caleb's laughter floated up through the floorboards like smoke signals from a distant tribe. They were drunk on champagne and hubris. They believed I was comatose in my bed, drooling on the pillow, while the poison worked its way through my system. They did not know that the poison had been filtered through the soil of a maidenhair fern, and that the woman creeping down the hall was more awake than she had been in years. I reached the narrow door at the end of the corridor. It was painted the same cream color as the wall, designed to blend in and be forgotten. It had not been opened in a decade. I gripped the small brass knob. My palm was damp with sweat. If the hinges squeaked, it would be over. The sound would carry down the stairwell like a gunshot. I turned the knob slowly. I felt the mechanism disengage. I pulled. The door stuck for a heartbeat held fast by layers of old paint and time, and then it gave way with a low groan that sounded to my ears like a scream. I froze, pressing my back against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited for the music downstairs to stop. I waited for heavy footsteps on the stairs. But the laughter continued. Sienna was telling a story about a client she had overcharged, and Caleb was cheering. I slipped through the gap and closed the door behind me. The air in the stairwell was frigid. It smelled of cedar and dry rot, and the memories of 1,000 dusty afternoons. I looked up. The stairs were steep and narrow, uncarpeted wood that disappeared into the gloom above. For a woman with a titanium hip and a cane, this was not a staircase. It was a mountain. I took the first step. My knee protested with a sharp spike of pain, but I ignored it. I hauled myself up using the rough wooden railing. 1 step, 2 steps. I counted them like beads on a rosary. There were 14 steps to the top. 14 steps to salvation. When my head cleared the floor level of the attic, I paused to catch my breath. The space was cavernous. The moonlight filtered in through the small dormer windows, cutting beams through the dust motes that danced in the air. It was a graveyard of abandoned hobbies. There was the easel I had used for a month in the 90s. There were the boxes of Caleb's childhood toys that I had saved because I thought he might want them for his own children one day. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth. I moved toward the far corner under the eaves. That was Arthur's corner. My late husband had been a man of precision, a surgeon who needed to disconnect from the world of flesh and blood by connecting to the world of waves and frequencies. The desk was still there, buried under a heavy canvas drop cloth. I limped over to it, my cane tapping softly on the floorboards. I grabbed the corner of the cloth and pulled. Dust billowed up, choking me, making my eyes water. I waved it away and looked down. The rig was beautiful. It was a Hallicrafter's transceiver from the 70s, a beast of brushed metal and dials with a large analog frequency display that looked like the dashboard of an old airplane. Beside it sat the heavy black Bakelite microphone and the Morse code key that Arthur had tried to teach me to use. I sat down in his old wooden chair. It creaked familiarly, embracing me. I looked at the power cord. It was thick and frayed at the end. I traced it to the wall outlet. It was unplugged. "Please," I whispered, "please let the wiring in this house be better than the plumbing." I plugged it in. I reached for the power switch, a heavy toggle that moved with a satisfying mechanical clunk. For a second, nothing happened. Then a small orange light flickered to life. A low hum began to build, a vibration that I could feel in the desk under my elbows. The vacuum tubes inside the machine were warming up, waking from their long slumber. The smell of ozone and hot dust filled the small corner of the attic. I put the heavy headphones over my ears. The leather was cracked and cold. Static. It was a wall of white noise, a rushing sound like a waterfall. It was the sound of the universe breathing. I reached for the large tuning dial. My hand shook, but this time it was not from age or infirmity. It was from anticipation. Arthur had always kept a schedule with his friends. The Tuesday night net. A group of old men scattered across the county who checked in on each other to talk about the weather and their ailments and the state of the world. Elias was one of them. Elias Thorne, my business partner, the man who knew more about orchids and radio waves than anyone else alive. But it wasn't Tuesday. It was Friday. And it was 2 p.m. I knew Elias kept his radio on in his workshop. He liked the background noise while he repotted seedlings. But would he be there? I spun the dial, watching the needle sweep across the frequencies. I needed the 20-meter band. That was where they used to talk. The static changed pitch, whistling and popping. I heard a snatch of a foreign language, maybe Russian, fading in and out. I heard a preacher shouting about salvation. I found the frequency. 14,255 megahertz. I grabbed the microphone. It felt heavy and cold in my hand. I pressed the push to talk button on the side. CQ, CQ, CQ. I said, my voice sounding thin and trembling in the vast attic. This is Kilo India 5. I stopped. I had forgotten Arthur's call sign. It had been 20 years. I closed my eyes, searching the archives of my memory. I saw him sitting here, his back to me, laughing into the mic. Kilo. India 5 Zulu X-ray Tango. I whispered. Kilo. India. A 5 Zulu X-ray Tango. Is anyone out there? I released the button. Static. Just the empty hiss of the atmosphere. I pressed it again. CQ, CQ. This is Matilda. Arthur's Matilda. I am looking for Elias Thorne. Call sign Whiskey 4. Something. Elias, please. Are you there? I released the button and waited. I stared at the signal meter, waiting for the needle to jump. Nothing. Tears pricked my eyes. It was a foolish idea. A romantic, desperate, foolish idea. The world had moved on to cell phones and fiber optics. No one was listening to the radio anymore. I was about to turn it off when the static broke. It wasn't a voice. It was a series of beeps. Da-dit-da-dit-da-da-dit-da. Morse code. I didn't know Morse code. Arthur had tried, but I had no ear for it. I grabbed the mic. I cannot understand you, I said, my voice rising in panic. I do not know the code. Please, speak to me. There was a pause. A long, agonizing silence where the only sound was the wind rattling the roof tiles above my head. Then a voice crackled through the headphones. It was distorted and tinny as if it were coming from the bottom of a well, but it was unmistakable. Matilda, is that you? Elias. I sobbed a sound that was torn from my throat. Elias, it is me. I am on Arthur's rig. Matilda, his voice came back stronger now, the signal locking in. My God, I haven't heard this call sign in decades. Where are you? I tried calling the house yesterday. The line was dead. They cut the line. I said, speaking quickly, pressing the microphone close to my lips. Caleb and Sienna. They cut the phone. They blocked the internet. Elias listened to me. I do not have much time. Slow down, Maddie, he said, his voice calm and steady. The voice of a man who dealt with crises one potting mix at a time. What is happening? Are you hurt? They are trying to take it all, Elias. They are stealing the estate. They poisoned me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Poisoned? They put something in my tea. A sedative. But it killed the fern, Elias. It killed the fern in an hour. They think I am asleep. They think I am incompetent. They have a notary coming tomorrow. They are going to make me sign the deed. I heard the sound of a chair scraping on a concrete floor. Elias had stood up. I am coming over there, he said. I will bring the police. I will break down the door. No, I hissed. No, Elias, you cannot. Why not? Because they have paperwork, I said, my mind racing. They have a power of attorney that they forged or tricked me into partially signing. They have a doctor's note saying, I am demented. If you come with the police now, Caleb will just show them the papers. He will say I am having an episode. He will say I am hallucinating. The police will look at me old and frail, and they will believe him. And then they will lock me away in a home where I can never talk to you again. Silence stretched between us. He knew I was right. The law was a blunt instrument, and Caleb knew how to wield it. So, what do we do? Elias asked. We need to catch them, I said. We need them to expose themselves. We need witnesses who are not the police. Witnesses they cannot dismiss. I looked around the attic, my eyes landing on an old box of party decorations. The retirement party, I said. What? Caleb mentioned a party. A celebration? He wants to show me off to the investors, to prove I am happy and retiring. He is bringing people here tomorrow night, to witness the signing. Okay, Elias said slowly. I need you to come, I said, but not as yourself. If they see you, they will panic. You need to come in the back way, through the kitchen, like you are delivering the catering, or the flowers. I can do that, he said. I still have the old van. And Elias. I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Bring the sample kits, the soil testing kits. And bring a lawyer, not Henderson. Henderson is compromised. Bring that shark you used when the city tried to rezone the nursery. Goldstein, Elias said. Yes, bring Goldstein. Hide him in the van. I will be there, Maddie, tomorrow. What time? 6 o'clock. But Elias? The midnight azure. What about it? It is freezing. They turned off the heat. It is alive, but barely. I heard a low growl from the other end of the radio. I am coming, Maddie, Elias said, and his voice was cold steel. I am coming, and I am bringing the cavalry. You just hold on. Do not drink anything. Do not sign anything. I won't. Over and out, Maddie. Over and out. I flipped the toggle switch. The orange light died. The hum faded. The static cut out, leaving me in the silence of the attic. I sat there for a moment, trembling. I had a lifeline. The seed had been planted. I stood up and carefully replaced the canvas drop cloth, making sure the dust settled exactly as it had been. I wiped the microphone with the hem of my sweater to remove my fingerprints. I moved back to the stairs. Going down was harder than coming up. My legs were shaking from the exertion and the adrenaline crash. I took it one step at a time, gripping the rail until my knuckles were white. I reached the bottom and opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty. The music downstairs had stopped. I slipped out and closed the door. I made it 3 steps down the hall when the door to the guest room opened. Sienna stepped out. She was wearing a silk robe, and her hair was wrapped in a towel. She looked at me. I stopped, my heart seizing in my chest. I was fully dressed in my winter clothes. I was standing in the hallway when I was supposed to be comatose in bed. Matilda, she said, her eyes narrowing. What are you doing? I thought fast. I let my body slump. I let my cane clatter to the floor. I looked at her with wide, vacant eyes. The bathroom. I mumbled, slurring my words. I couldn't find the bathroom. Sienna sighed a long, dramatic exhale of annoyance. The bathroom is in your room, Matilda. Right next to your bed. My God, you really are losing it, aren't you? She walked over to me. She didn't smell like champagne anymore. She smelled of expensive lotion. She grabbed my arm, not gently. Come on, she said, turning me around. Back to bed, before you hurt yourself. She marched me back to my room. She pushed me toward the bed. Get in, she ordered. I climbed in, shoes and all. She shook her head. Unbelievable. Look at you. Dressed for a blizzard in the middle of the house. Caleb was right. We need to get you into a facility sooner rather than later. She grabbed the duvet and threw it over me. Stay, she commanded like she was training a dog. She walked to the door. And if you get up again, I'm locking this door from the outside. Do you understand? I nodded my head, bobbing loosely. Good night, Matilda. She slammed the door. I lay in the dark, listening to her footsteps fade. I reached under the mattress and touched the cold, hard plastic of the radio tube I had slipped into my pocket. It wasn't a tube. It was a fuse. I had taken the spare fuse from the radio just in case they found it. Without it, the radio was a brick. I smiled in the darkness. Facility. She thought she was sending me to a facility. Tomorrow night, she was going to find out that she was the one who was trapped. The morning of the party arrived with the aggressive roar of a vacuum cleaner banging against my bedroom door. I lay still for a moment, cataloging the aches in my body. My hip was a dull throb from the excursion to the attic, and my head felt light but clear. The tea I had poured into the fern was the only thing Sienna had given me, so my mind was sharp. It was a knife kept in a velvet sheath, and today I would need to keep it hidden until the moment to strike. I sat up slowly, practicing the tremor in my hands. I held them up in front of my face and willed them to shake. It was a macabre rehearsal. I had to be the thing they feared most. A liability, a mess, a confused old woman who needed to be managed. The door flew open and Sienna marched in. She was already dressed in a sharp black suit that made her look like a funeral director for the wealthy. She carried a garment bag and a makeup case. Up, she said, clapping her hands. No time for lollygagging today, Matilda. We have guests arriving at 6. The investors, the board members, the people who are going to secure your future. She unzipped the bag. Inside was a dress I had not worn in 20 years. It was a heavy brocade thing with a high collar and stiff lace cuffs. It was a dress for a dowager, a dress for a woman who has given up on life and is just waiting for the history books to claim her. Where did you find that? I asked, letting my voice wobble. In the back of the closet, she said, pulling it out. It is dignified. It screams legacy. And it covers up, well, everything. She meant it covered up my frailty. It covered up the weight I had lost. Come on, let's get you into the chair. I need to do something about your face. You look like a ghost. I let her manhandle me into the vanity chair. She applied foundation with a heavy hand, smearing the beige paste over my wrinkles. She drew on eyebrows that were too high, giving me a permanent look of surprised senility. She painted my lips a garish pink. I stared at myself in the mirror. I looked like a ventriloquist's dummy. Beautiful, she lied, stepping back to admire her work. Now sit tight. Caleb wants to see you in the study. He has some things for you to sign before the madness starts. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. The pre-game warm-up. I shuffled down the hall, leaning heavily on my cane. I made sure to drag my left foot, slightly scuffing the toe of my shoe against the floorboards. I heard Caleb in the study pacing. I pushed the door open. Caleb was wearing a tuxedo. He looked handsome in a superficial way, like a model in a magazine advertisement for cologne, but his eyes were darting around the room. Maddie, come in," he said, ushering me to the chair in front of the desk. "You look great. Very regal." He didn't look at me. He looked at the papers spread out on the desk. "We have a little bit of housekeeping to do," he said, smoothing a document. "Before the notary gets here tonight, I need you to sign these transfer authorizations. It is just moving some funds around to cover the party costs and the renovations." He placed a pen in my hand. It was a heavy Mont Blanc. "Just sign right there next to the yellow sticky note." I looked at the document. It wasn't for party costs. It was a wire transfer authorization for the remaining balance of my investment portfolio. $700,000. The destination account was in the Cayman Islands. The name of the holding company was printed clearly at the top. Azure Shell Limited. I felt a surge of rage so hot, I thought it would melt the makeup on my face. They were cleaning me out completely. I gripped the pen. I let my hand shake violently. The tip of the pen tapped a staccato rhythm against the paper. I can't hold it steady, Caleb," I whined. "My hand, it won't stop." He sighed, grabbing my wrist. "Just steady it, Maddie. Focus. It's just your name. Matilda Galloway." I tried. I really did. I put the pen to the paper and dragged it across. But instead of my signature, I made a jagged line that tore through the paper. "Whoops," I said. Caleb swore under his breath. "Damn it, Maddie. That was an original." He pulled another copy from the drawer. He had a stack of them. "Try again, and don't push so hard. Just flow, like you used to." I tried again. This time I managed an M, but then I let the pen slip from my fingers. It rolled across the desk and fell onto the floor. "Oh dear," I said, blinking rapidly. "I am so clumsy today." Caleb dove under the desk to retrieve it. While his head was down, I leaned forward. Under the stack of transfer papers was another document, a blueprint. It was a site plan for the Glasshouse estate, but the greenhouses were gone. In their place were 3 blocks of condos, and at the bottom in the owner box, it didn't say Galloway. It said Caleb Vance and Associates. He had already drawn up the plans. He had already sold the land in his mind. Caleb popped back up red-faced. "Okay, forget the signature for now," he said, snatching the papers away. "You are too shaky. We will do it tonight. The notary has a stamp. We can use a thumbprint if we have to. It is legal if witnessed." A thumbprint. He was going to treat me like an illiterate peasant. He sat back and looked at me. "Now listen carefully, Maddie. Tonight is important. These people coming, they are important. I need you to be on your best behavior." He pulled a cue card from his pocket. "I wrote down a few things for you to say. Just simple things. Thank you for coming. I am so happy to be retiring. My nephew is doing a wonderful job. Can you remember that?" I took the card. My nephew is doing a wonderful job. The words swam before my eyes. "I think so," I whispered. "I just want to go to bed, Caleb." "You can go to bed as soon as the papers are signed," he said. "As soon as the house is sold and the money is safe, you can sleep for a week. But tonight you perform." "Got it." I nodded. "Good. Now go sit in the library. Don't wander. Don't touch anything. I have the caterers coming in 10 minutes. I stood up and shuffled out of the room. I clutched the cue card in my hand. I went to the library, but I didn't sit. I went to the window. The driveway was filling up with vans, a catering truck, a florist van, And then a small, battered gray van pulled up around the back near the kitchen entrance. It had a faded logo on the side. Thorn Landscaping. Elias. He was here. I watched as a man in a green jumpsuit got out. He pulled a cap low over his eyes. He carried a large crate of vegetables. My heart soared. The cavalry had arrived, and he was carrying turnips. I moved away from the window before anyone could see me. I sat in my wingback chair and closed my eyes. I rehearsed my lines, not the ones Caleb gave me, my own lines. The lines I would say when the trap was sprung. The hours passed in a blur of activity. I heard the clinking of glasses. I heard the vacuum again. I heard Sienna shouting at a waiter about the placement of the napkins. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The first guests. Caleb came to fetch me. He checked my makeup. He adjusted my collar. "Showtime, Maddie," he said, gripping my elbow. Smile. He led me into the foyer. The house was transformed. The lighting was low and golden. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne. Men in suits and women in cocktail dresses mingled, laughing and talking. This was my house, but these were not my friends. These were sharks. Real estate developers. Bankers. Pharmaceutical reps. They were here to pick the carcass clean. Caleb announced me loudly. "And here she is, the lady of the hour, my beloved Aunt Matilda." The room turned. Applause rippled through the crowd. It was polite, condescending applause. I shrank into Caleb's side, playing the part. I blinked against the flash of a camera. Someone shouted a question. "So, Matilda, what will you do with all your free time now?" Caleb squeezed my arm. "The cue card. I stammered, looking around wildly. "I am just happy." I managed to get out. "Happy to rest." "Good," Caleb whispered. He led me to a chair that had been set up like a throne in the center of the room. He sat me down. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. "I'm going to get the lawyer." He walked away, leaving me alone in the spotlight. People approached me. They leaned down, speaking loudly and slowly as if I were deaf. "Beautiful house, Matilda. You must be sad to leave it." I smiled a vacant smile. "The soup is cold," I said nonsensically. They nodded politely and backed away, whispering to each other. "She's really gone, isn't she?" "Sad. At least the nephew is stepping up." I scanned the room. I was looking for the green jumpsuit. I saw a waiter moving through the crowd near the kitchen door. He was older than the others. He moved with a slight limp. He turned, and our eyes met. Elias. He was wearing a white waiter's jacket now, but it was too tight across the shoulders. He held a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He nodded once, a microscopic movement. Then he looked toward the library door. Standing in the shadows of the library was a short, round man with glasses. He was clutching a briefcase to his chest, like a shield. Goldstein, the shark. They were in position. Now I just needed the notary. 10 minutes later, the front door opened again. A tall woman with a severe bun and a leather portfolio walked in. She looked like an executioner. Caleb rushed to greet her. "Ms. Sterling, right on time." He led her toward me. The crowd parted. The murmuring died down. This was the main event. Caleb stood next to my chair. He raised a glass. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," he boomed. The room went silent. "Tonight is a bittersweet night. We are celebrating the incredible career of my Aunt Matilda Galloway. But we are also turning a page. As many of you know, Aunt Mattie's health has been declining. It has become too much for her to manage this estate alone. So tonight, with the help of our friends at Apex Construct, we are signing the agreement to transfer the property and secure her care for the rest of her life." There was a murmur of approval. "So responsible." "Good lad." Caleb placed a document on the small table in front of me. The deed. And Ms. Sterling is here to witness the signature. He uncapped the Mont Blanc pen. "Here you go, Maddie," he said, his voice soft and coaxing. "Just like we practiced. Right on the line." He tried to hand me the pen. I looked at it. I looked at the crowd. I looked at Sienna, who was standing in the front row, smiling that predatory smile. I didn't take the pen. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Caleb laughed nervously. "She's a little nervous. It's a big crowd." He tried to force the pen into my fingers. "Maddie, take the pen." I looked up at him. I let my jaw go slack. I said, my voice trembling. "Yes." "What do you want, Maddie?" "I want to see the flowers." A ripple of laughter went through the room. Caleb's smile tightened. "We can see the flowers later, Maddie. Sign first." "No," I said louder this time. "The blue ones, the midnight ones." Caleb leaned in close, his breath hot in my ear. "Sign the damn paper, you old bat, or I swear to God I will put you in the basement." I flinched. The microphone on the podium next to us picked it up. It was faint but audible. A few people in the front row frowned. I looked past him. I looked at Elias. Elias dropped his tray. The crash of metal and breaking glass was like a bomb going off in the silent room. Everyone jumped. Caleb spun around. "What the hell?" he shouted. Elias stepped forward, stepping over the broken canapes. He pulled a soil testing kit from his pocket. "I wouldn't sign that if I were you, Matilda," he said, his voice booming. "Not until we talk about the toxicology report." Caleb froze. "Who are you?" Elias took off his glasses and wiped them. "I am the man who just tested the soil in your aunt's bedroom, Fern," he said. "And I am the man who is wondering why there is enough sedative in that pot to kill a horse." The room erupted in whispers. Caleb turned pale. He looked at me. I stopped shaking. I sat up straight in my chair. I smoothed the brocade dress. I looked him dead in the eye. "I think he is talking to you, Caleb," I said, my voice clear and cold as ice. The performance was over. The trial was about to begin. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the kind of vacuum that exists in the center of a tornado before the winds come back to tear the roof off. Caleb stood frozen, his hand still extended, holding the pen that I had refused to take. His face was a study in rapid calculation. The charm was cracking the varnish, peeling away to reveal the rot underneath. He pulled his hand back slowly and forced a laugh. It was a terrible sound, brittle and wet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to the crowd, his arms wide. "I am so sorry. As I said, my aunt is, well, she has her good days and her bad days. And today is clearly a very bad day. She gets paranoid. She hallucinates." He pointed a finger at Elias, who was standing by the ruins of the hors d'oeuvres tray. "And this man," he shouted, his voice gaining false confidence. "This man is a trespasser, a disgruntled former employee who has been stalking the family. I want him removed immediately. Someone call the police." I stood up. I did not use the arms of the chair. I did not lean on my cane. I stood up using the muscles in my legs that I had been secretly exercising for 2 days. I stood up to my full height, which was only 5'4", but in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. "Sit down, Caleb," I said. My voice was not the quavering whisper of an invalid. It was the voice I used when I had to address the Royal Horticultural Society. It was a voice of command. Caleb blinked. He looked at me as if I had just spoken in tongues. "Maddie, please." he hissed, stepping toward me. You are embarrassing yourself. Sit down. I turned my back on him. I faced the room. I faced the sea of expensive suits and curious faces. I am not hallucinating, I said, speaking clearly to the back of the room. And I am not paranoid, but I am angry. I reached into the bodice of my dress. The movement was unladylike and shocking to the genteel crowd. I pulled out the crumpled envelope I had hidden next to my skin. The letter from the bank. I walked over to the tall man in the gray suit standing in the front row. I knew who he was. Mr. Sterling, the CEO of Apex Construct, the man who wanted to bulldoze my life. I held the paper out to him. Mr. Sterling, I presume. He looked at the paper, then at me. He hesitated. Take it, I said. It is a record of a wire transfer authorized yesterday morning. $50,000 moved from my personal savings into a shell company owned by my nephew. A transfer made while I was unconscious. Caleb lunged forward. Don't touch that. It's a forgery. She's crazy. But Elias stepped in. He moved fast for an old man with a bad knee. He blocked Caleb's path, planting himself like an old oak tree. I wouldn't do that, son, Elias said quietly. Mr. Sterling took the paper. He smoothed it out. He read it. His eyebrows went up. He looked at Caleb. This is dated yesterday at 9 a.m. You told us you had power of attorney signed 3 days ago. But the notary is here now to witness the signing. Caleb's face flushed a deep, ugly red. It was a verbal agreement, he stammered. A pending authorization. We were just expediting the process to ensure the funds were available for the care facility. I laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound. There is no care facility, Caleb, unless you mean the prison you belong in. I turned back to the crowd. My name is Matilda Galloway. I am the sole owner of the Glasshouse estate. I am of sound mind. I am not retiring. I am not selling. And I certainly did not invite any of you here to eat my food and drink my wine while you planned the demolition of my life's work. I saw the shift in the room. It was like watching a tide turn. The investors exchanged looks. They were business people. They smelled risk. And right now, I was a walking, talking liability. Ms. Sterling, the notary, closed her portfolio with a snap. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice cool and professional. I was told this was a standard transfer of assets due to medical incapacity. This appears to be a hostile takeover. It is not hostile, Caleb shouted, losing control now. She is senile. Look at her. She's wearing a dress from 1980. She talks to plants. She thinks the gardener is a scientist. From the shadows of the library, a voice spoke up. Actually, he is a scientist. And so am I. Benjamin Goldstein stepped into the light. He was short and round, and he clutched his briefcase like a weapon. He wore a suit that was rumpled, but his eyes were sharp behind his thick glasses. Who the hell are you? Caleb demanded. Benjamin Goldstein, attorney at law. I represented the Galloway estate for 30 years before you decided to cut the phone lines. Goldstein walked to the center of the room. He placed his briefcase on a side table and popped the latches. The sound echoed like gunshots. I have here an affidavit from Dr. Elias Thorne regarding the chemical analysis of soil samples taken from Mrs. Galloway's bedroom this afternoon. He pulled out a document. The analysis shows high concentrations of benzodiazepines and synthetic opioids, enough to induce a coma in an elephant, let alone a 70-year-old woman. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath. Goldstein held up another paper. And this is a copy of the blueprints you filed with the county planning office 3 weeks ago, before Mrs. Galloway even had her fall. He looked at the crowd. This was premeditated. It is fraud. It is elder abuse. And it is attempted murder. Sienna made a sound. It was a whimper. She was backing away toward the kitchen door, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood. "I wouldn't go that way," my dear Elias called out without looking at her. "The police are parked around back. They are just waiting for my signal." Sienna froze. She looked at Caleb. Her eyes were wide with terror. "You said this was airtight," she hissed at him. "You said she was a vegetable." "I am a perennial, my dear," I said, stepping toward her. "We go dormant in the winter, but we always come back." Caleb looked around the room. He was a trapped animal. The investors were backing away, leaving a wide circle around him. Mr. Sterling had already put his phone to his ear and was walking toward the front door. This is a setup," Caleb stammered. "You planned this. You tricked me." "I tricked you?" I asked, tilting my head. "You moved into my house? You drugged my tea? You killed my orchids? You tried to erase me, Caleb." "I just turned the lights back on." I looked at the guests. "Get out," I said. It wasn't a scream. It was a statement of fact. "Get out of my house! All of you! The party is over." They didn't need to be told twice. There was a rush for the coat rack. The investors, the board members, the hangers-on, they all scrambled for the door, like cockroaches when the kitchen light snaps on. They didn't look at Caleb. They didn't look at me. They just wanted to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Vance scheme. Within 2 minutes, the room was empty. Except for us. Me, Elias, Goldstein, and Caleb and Sienna standing in the center of the ruin of their ambitions. Caleb's hands were shaking now. The tremor had passed from me to him. "You can't prove the poison," he said, his voice low. "You can't prove I put it there. You probably did it yourself, to frame me. You're crazy enough to do it." I reached into my bra again. It was becoming quite the storage unit. I pulled out the blue plastic cap. "I found this in the greenhouse, Caleb, next to the broken stem of the Rothschildianum. It belongs to the bottle of ammonia you used to weaken the plant." I held it up. "I wonder if your fingerprints are on it, or maybe Sienna's." Sienna burst into tears. "It was me," she wailed. "He made me do it. He said it was the only way to get you to sign the papers. He said you loved the plants more than him." Caleb spun on her. "Shut up, Sienna. Shut up." He raised his hand as if to strike her. Elias stepped forward, his fists clenched. But he didn't need to. The front door opened. It wasn't a guest. It was 2 uniformed officers and a detective in a trench coat. The blue lights from the cruiser pulsed through the open door, painting the walls of the foyer in a rhythmic strobe. Mr. Vance, the detective, said, stepping over the threshold. "Miss Moretti, I think we need to have a chat about a wire transfer." Caleb looked at the police. He looked at me. For a second, I saw the little boy he used to be. The boy who used to run through my garden chasing butterflies. The boy I had loved. "Aunt Mattie," he whispered. "Please." I looked at him. My heart broke a little, but my resolve did not. "I am not your Aunt Mattie right now. Caleb," I said softly. I pointed to the door. "I am the plaintiff." The blue lights of the police cruisers pulsing through the open front door turned the foyer into a strobe-lit nightmare. It was a rhythmic flashing that made everything look like a stop-motion film. 1 second, Caleb was standing tall in his tuxedo, and the next, he was bent over the hood of a car with his hands behind his back. 1 second, Sienna was weeping into her hands, and the next, she was being guided firmly by a female officer toward the back seat of a patrol car. I stood on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket that Elias had found for me and watched the harvest of their greed. It was a bitter crop. There was no joy in it. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my home, and it was littered with the debris of their betrayal. Caleb turned his head as the officer pushed him down into the car. His face was pressed against the glass. He looked at me. His eyes were wide and wet and filled with a terrifying mix of hatred and pleading. He mouthed something. I couldn't hear him over the crackle of the police radios and the idling engines, but I knew what he was saying. I am family. I looked away. I looked at the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the end of the driveway. It had lost a heavy branch in a storm last winter. I had hired a surgeon to cut the wound clean and seal it so the rot wouldn't spread to the heartwood. That was what I was doing now. I was cutting off the limb to save the tree. The doors slammed. The engines revved. The cars pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel, carrying my nephew and his fiancée down the long driveway and out of my life. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. It was broken only by the sound of the wind in the eaves and the heavy breathing of Benjamin Goldstein standing next to me. "Well," he said, adjusting his glasses, "that was dramatic. I haven't seen a show like that since I did criminal defense in the 90s. He snapped his briefcase shut. "I will head to the station to file the formal statement regarding the fraud and the elder abuse charges, Matilda. You don't need to come down tonight. The detective said he would come by tomorrow for your full deposition. Tonight, you just rest." "Thank you, Benjamin," I said. My voice felt hollow. It felt like I had used up all my words for the next decade. He nodded and patted my hand. He walked to his car, a sensible sedan parked behind Elias's van, and drove away. Then it was just me and Elias. We stood on the porch of the empty house. The front door was still open, letting the freezing air rush into the foyer, chilling the expensive hors d'oeuvres that lay scattered on the floor. Elias looked at me. He was still wearing the white waiter's jacket, but he had taken off the bow tie. He looked tired. He looked old. "Are you okay, Maddie?" he asked softly. "I don't know," I said. "I feel light, like I might float away." He stepped closer and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. It was a solid, heavy weight that anchored me. "Come on, let's go inside. We need to close the door. It's freezing out here." We walked back into the house. The foyer was a mess. Broken glass trampled food, muddy footprints from the police officers. The air smelled of stale perfume and cold reality. Elias closed the heavy front door and threw the deadbolt. The click echoed through the house. I looked at the mess. "I need to clean this up," I said, bending down to pick up a smashed cracker. "I cannot have my house looking like this." Elias caught my hand. "No," he said firmly. "You are not cleaning anything tonight. Leave it. The rats can have the crackers. You need to sit down before you fall down." He led me into the kitchen. It was warmer there. The oven was still on from the caterers. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a chair. The chair was back in its proper place. He must have moved it while the police were reading Caleb his rights. I sat. My legs were trembling again, but this time it was just simple exhaustion. The adrenaline was gone, leaving me empty. Elias busied himself at the stove. He found the kettle. He found the tin of real tea, the Earl Grey, that I kept hidden in the back of the pantry. I watched him move. He moved with the economy of a man who had spent 40 years in a workshop. No wasted motion. He placed a steaming mug in front of me. "Drink," he said, "and don't worry. I made it myself. No additives." I wrapped my hands around the mug. The heat seeped into my palms. I took a sip. It tasted of bergamot and safety. "Thank you, Elias, for everything," For the radio, for the soil test, for the vegetables. He chuckled, leaning against the counter. The vegetables were a nice touch, right? I thought the turnips added an air of authenticity. I smiled. It was a weak smile, but it was real. How did you know? I asked. How did you know to bring Goldstein? I didn't, at first, he said. But when you told me about the notary, I knew we needed a heavy hitter. And when I tested that soil, Maddie, his face darkened. I have seen pesticides that were less toxic than what was in that pot. If you had drunk that whole cup, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We both knew. I looked down at my tea. He hated me, Elias. He hated me because I was still alive, because I was in the way of his money. Greed is a powerful blight, Elias said. It rots everything it touches. Roots, stems, flowers. It doesn't care about family. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the house settle. The refrigerator hummed. The wind rattled the window pane. Then a thought struck me. A sharp spike of panic that cut through the fatigue. The midnight azure. I sat up straight. Elias. The power. What about it? Caleb said the internet was down because of the storm, but he lied. But the greenhouse? The breaker was tripped. I don't know if he turned it back on, or if he just left it. Elias set his mug down. We should check, he said. Do you feel up to a walk? I grabbed my cane. For that, yes, always. We put on our coats. Elias found a flashlight in the utility drawer. We stepped out into the night. The cold was biting, but the wind had died down. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the path to the glass houses. We walked in silence, the gravel crunching under our feet. As we rounded the corner of the rhododendrons, I looked for the glow. The orange sodium glow of the grow lights. It was dark. My heart sank. He left it off, I whispered. He left them to freeze. We hurried to the door. Elias shone the flashlight on the lock. It was open. We stepped inside. The air was freezing. It was the same temperature as the outside. The smell of death was stronger now. The rot of the frozen tissues had set in. Elias swept the beam of the flashlight across the benches. It was a graveyard. The phalaenopsis were black slime. The giant staghorn ferns were brown husks. Years of work. Decades of collection. Gone in 3 nights of neglect. I felt tears pricking my eyes, hot and angry. It is all gone, I said, my voice breaking. He took everything. Elias moved the light. Let's check the azure, he said. We walked to the back corner, the special enclosure. Elias shone the light through the glass walls. The plant sat there in its pot. It looked gray and lifeless. The flower spike, the one I had seen drooping yesterday, was now completely shriveled. It hung down like a piece of dead string. I opened the door to the enclosure. I reached in and touched the pseudobulb. The thick, fleshy base of the plant. It was cold, stone cold. But it was firm. I pressed my thumb into it. It didn't squish. It resisted. Elias, I said, shine the light here, at the base. He brought the beam closer. I peered at the soil line. There, buried under the bark mulch, was a tiny nub. A green swell. It was a new growth eye. A survival shoot. It is alive, I whispered. Are you sure? Elias asked, leaning in. Yes. Look, the primary bulb sacrificed the leaves and the flower to save the core. It went dormant. It is in deep shock, but the heart is still beating. I looked at Elias. Tears were streaming down my face now, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. It survived him. Elias smiled in the darkness, just like its owner. "We need to get it out of here," I said, standing up. "We need to get it to your greenhouse. This system is dead. The pipes might be burst. We cannot risk it here tonight." Elias nodded. "I'll get the van. You wrap it up." He handed me the flashlight and ran back up the path. I took off my heavy wool coat. I was freezing in just my dress, but I didn't care. I wrapped the coat around the pot, swaddling the orchid like a newborn baby. I held it to my chest. I could feel the cold radiating from the clay pot. But I imagined I could also feel a faint pulse of life. I looked around the dark, ruined greenhouse. "Goodbye," I whispered to the dead plants. "You were good soldiers." I walked out into the night, clutching the midnight azure. Elias pulled the van up to the path. He jumped out and opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "Turn on the heater." I climbed in, cradling the plant on my lap. The heat from the vents blasted my face. We drove slowly down the driveway past the house that was finally quiet, past the spot where the police cars had been. I looked back at the manor. It looked dark and imposing against the night sky. It was a big, empty house, too big for one old woman. But it was mine, and tomorrow I would start the process of deciding what to do with it. But for tonight, I was going to a place where the air was warm and the humidity was 70%, and the only people allowed in were the ones who knew how to nurture things, not destroy them. I looked down at the plant in my lap. "We made it," I whispered. We drove out the gate and turned onto the main road. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. The harvest was over. The weeds had been pulled. The soil was tilled. Now it was time to replant. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. It took 6 months for the courts to process the wreckage of what Caleb and Sienna had done, and during those 6 months, I watched the winter thaw into a hesitant spring. I attended every hearing. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my best tweed suit and holding my cane not for support, but as a scepter of authority. I watched as the charming facade of my nephew crumbled under the weight of evidence. Caleb tried to plead ignorance. He tried to claim he was a victim of Sienna's manipulation, but the digital trail he had left was a highway of greed that led straight to his bank account. Sienna turned on him in a heartbeat, trading her loyalty for a reduced sentence. It was a sordid spectacle of finger-pointing and desperate lies, but I watched it all with a detached, clinical interest. They were like specimens under a microscope revealing their true cellular structure, which was composed entirely of selfishness. When the judge finally handed down the sentences, 5 years for fraud and elder abuse for Caleb and 3 for Sienna, I felt no joy. I felt no triumph. I just felt a quiet sense of order being restored. The invasive species had been weeded out, and the garden was safe to grow again. I walked out of the courthouse that day and into the bright April sunshine. Elias was waiting for me by his van. He had traded the turnips for a bouquet of daffodils. "It is done," he said simply, opening the door for me. "It is done." I agreed. "Now take me home. I have work to do." The glasshouse estate had changed in the months since the harvest. The silence that had once felt oppressive was now filled with the sounds of industry. I had not hired a demolition crew to tear down the greenhouses as Caleb had planned. I had hired a restoration crew. I used the money the bank had recovered from the Cayman Islands account to fund the repairs. There was a poetic justice in using Caleb's stolen treasure to rebuild the very thing he had tried to destroy. The broken glass was replaced with high-efficiency double glazing. The rusted heaters were swapped for state-of-the-art climate control systems. The old wooden benches were replaced with aluminum and mesh, but the biggest change was in the house itself. I realized during those long winter nights alone that the manor was too big for one woman and her memories. It was a vessel that needed to be filled. I didn't want it to become a museum of my past life, and I certainly didn't want it to become a condo complex after I was gone. So I made a decision. I walked through the empty rooms on a Tuesday morning in May. The furniture had been put back in its rightful place. The rug in the hallway was flat and secure. The tea in my cup was pure Earl Grey. I walked to the library where I had been a prisoner in my own home. I opened the window and let the sweet scent of lilac drift in. Elias walked in carrying a stack of papers. "The lawyers are here, Maddie," he said. "Are you sure about this?" I turned to him. "I am sure. I have never been more sure of anything." We walked into the dining room. The long mahogany table was covered in documents, but this time the lawyers were not sharks in cheap suits. They were specialists in land trusts and non-profit organizations. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. There was no tremor today. I signed the deed, but I wasn't signing it over to a developer. I was signing it over to the Matilda Galloway Botanical Trust. The house would become a research center for horticulture students. The upstairs bedrooms would be dormitories for interns. The library would be a public archive. And the greenhouses would be a sanctuary for endangered species, a living bank of genetic diversity. I laid the pen down. There I said, "It is safe. No one can ever bulldoze it. No one can ever steal it. It belongs to the future now." Elias smiled. "You know Arthur would have loved this." "I think he would," I said. "He always liked a full house." But the real celebration was yet to come. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of apricot and violet, Elias and I walked down the path to the main glass house. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling of damp earth and life. The fans hummed a gentle lullaby. The benches were filling up again with seedlings and rescued plants that I had acquired over the spring. But we walked past them all to the special enclosure at the back. The midnight azure had spent the winter in Elias's intensive care unit. It had looked dead for weeks, a gray lump of organic matter that refused to wake up. But I had talked to it every day. I had misted it by hand. I had played it classical music. And slowly, miraculously, it had responded. The survival shoot I had seen that dark night had grown into a robust pseudobulb. And from that bulb, a flower spike had emerged thick and strong, arching gracefully over the pot. Tonight was the night. We stood before the glass case. "It is opening," Elias whispered. We watched in reverence as the sepals began to part. It was a slow, microscopic movement, like a waking stretch. The tightly furled bud began to unfurl. The color was breathtaking. It wasn't just blue. It was the color of the ocean at deepest night. It was the color of a bruised sky. It was a deep, velvety indigo that seemed to absorb the light. And then the scent hit us. Most orchids have no scent, or they smell of vanilla or chocolate. The midnight azure smelled of ozone and spice. It smelled like a storm after a drought. "It is perfect," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It is better than perfect," Elias said. "It is a survivor." I looked at the flower. It had been frozen, It had been neglected. It had been written off as dead trash. But it had held onto its life force deep in its roots, waiting for the warmth to return. It was me. I reached out and touched the velvet petal. It was cool and firm. "I am going to name it," I said. "I thought it was called the Midnight Azure," Elias said. "That is the hybrid name," I said. "But this specific plant? This survivor? It needs a clonal name." I thought about the last 6 months. I thought about the fear and the poison and the betrayal. But then I thought about the fight. I thought about the moment I stood up in front of the investors. I thought about the taste of the tea I poured into the fern. "I am calling it the Matilda," I said. Elias laughed a rich, warm sound that filled the glass house. "The Matilda," he repeated. "Tough, resilient, and a little bit prickly if you handle it wrong." "Exactly," I said, smiling. We stood there for a long time, watching the flower fully open, revealing its complex inner lip. It was a masterpiece of evolution designed to attract the right pollinator, designed to endure. We walked back to the house under the stars. The new sign for the sanctuary was already up at the gate. The Galloway Botanical Center. I stopped on the porch and looked out over my land. The lights of the greenhouse glowed in the distance, a beacon in the dark. I was 72 years old. My hip was metal. My family was gone. But I was not alone. And I was not finished. I had a school to run. I had interns to terrorize with my standards. I had a legacy to build that was made of roots and soil, not bank accounts and lies. I turned to Elias. "Tea?" I asked. "Real tea," he said. We went inside, and I closed the door. But I didn't lock it. The fear was gone. The house was open. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready for whatever the next season would bring. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that family is defined by blood, or by the people who show up when the frost sets in? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.